What happens when the mind behind the crown begins to crack? Not in secret, but in full view of courtiers, ministers, and kingdoms too terrified to speak. This isn't about eccentricity. It's about monarchs whose unraveling shaped wars, rewrote laws, and shattered empires. Some were mad, others were merely inconvenient. All were dangerous to someone. These are not fairy tales. These are 25 rulers whose minds bent reality, and history bent with them. Welcome to a kingdom of silence, scandal, and secrets too unstable to bury. This is 25 kings and queens who were mentally ill. You've never met royalty like this. Before we descend into royal chaos, a quick question for you, dear listener. Where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it as you press play on centuries of unraveling power? Midnight? Noon? Somewhere in between? If you like mysteries wrapped in monarchies and history that stares back, hit subscribe. It keeps the court whispers coming. And you won't want to miss what's next. 1. Charles VI. There are kings who lost battles. There are kings who lost kingdoms. And then there was Charles VI, who lost himself. Crowned at the age of 11 and ruling France through the infernal gears of the 100 Years' War, Charles VI was supposed to be the sober restoration of royal order. His father, Charles V, had been the intellectual king, the wise. France was tired of internal squabbling and dynastic bitterness. It needed a strong anchor. Instead, it got a monarch who would come to be known not for peace, wisdom, or power, but for thinking he was made of glass. That wasn't a metaphor. He quite literally feared he would shatter. But let's rewind, because the breakdown didn't come all at once. At first, Charles was everything France needed him to be. Handsome, intelligent, fluent in statecraft, or at least fluent in court ceremony, which was often the same thing. In his teens, he embodied the idea of divine monarchy, polished, promising, palatable. Then came August 1392. Historians often call it a turning point, but that's a generous euphemism. Charles was riding with his men to Brittany, chasing down the would-be assassin of his friend and advisor, Olivier de Clisson. It was hot. The sun was relentless. The royal party had paused to rest. They were quiet, tired, and tense. And then, without warning, Charles drew his sword and attacked. Not an enemy, not a conspirator, his own entourage. Accounts say he killed at least one knight and injured others before being restrained, reportedly shouting that he was betrayed. He then collapsed, unconscious, unreachable. When he woke, he didn't remember a thing. And France, which had already seen plenty of political instability, watched its future dissolve in real time. The event was not dismissed as a passing fever. Over the next few years, the episodes came back. And each time, the court had fewer excuses to offer. There were periods of lucidity, some long enough to give hope, but the relapses were unmistakable. They weren't just oddities or quirks. They were full dislocations from reality. One time, Charles reportedly refused to bathe or change clothes for 5 months. On other occasions, he ran screaming through the corridors of his palace, unable to recognize his own wife or children. He was seen talking to people who weren't there. He forgot his own name, and most famously, though likely exaggerated in later accounts, he came to believe his body was made of glass. Not metaphorically fragile, literally glass. So he reportedly wore reinforced clothing and refused to let anyone touch him. The glass delusion might sound poetic, but in the medieval mind, it was horrifyingly literal. It was a symbol of the self reduced to object, transparent, brittle. One slip from annihilation. To the court chroniclers, Charles wasn't just sick. He had become a walking theological riddle. How could God's anointed fall apart? France's actual governance during these episodes turned into a royal hostage crisis. Regency arrangements were messy, unofficial, or fought over. His uncles stepped in. Then his wife, Queen Isabeau. Then rival princes. Every time Charles slipped from lucidity, a new faction pulled up a chair and reached for the crown's keys. The Duke of Burgundy, the Duke of Orleans, the Armagnacs, the Bourguignons. Every power broker in France used the king's illness to tighten their grip on the throne, or to pry it loose entirely. And of course, England was watching. This wasn't just palace drama. Charles's mental breakdowns were national vulnerabilities. England invaded again in 1415, winning the stunning victory at Agincourt. Charles, during this period, could barely string together a conversation. His crown had become a ceremonial object, passed around by foreign policy and internal rot. Modern historians have tried to retrofit Charles's illness with contemporary diagnoses. Some argue for schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Others for bipolar disorder with psychosis. There are even theories about neuroinflammatory conditions or toxin exposure. But all those theories rest on inference, because of course the court doctors didn't record his neurotransmitter profiles or conduct standardized assessments. What they did document, however, was consistent incapacity. This wasn't the flakiness of eccentric nobility. This was a sovereign who could not distinguish dream from state policy, a monarch who could not recognize his own reflection, a man who once fled in terror from his own image in a mirror, convinced it was someone coming to harm him. And yet, somehow, Charles remained king for 42 years. That's the strange, haunting irony. A king whose mental life was a ruin presided, in name, over a kingdom sliding into real ruin. France split into civil war during his reign. His son, the Dauphin, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Treaty of Troyes, which disinherited him in favor of Henry V of England, who conveniently married Charles's daughter and prepared to inherit the French crown. What had once been madness in the court was now enshrined as geopolitical collapse. The king had become, functionally, an empty chair with a crown on it. But that chair still had ceremonial power, still had royal weight, and that meant his illness remained a political battleground long after it stopped being a medical one. No wonder historians keep circling back to him. Because Charles VI forces a question most royal history tries to avoid. What happens when the mind of a king disappears, but the throne remains? Not abdicated, not transferred, not executed, just empty, like a glass shell. It's easy to get lost in the details of his delusions. The glass, the paranoia, the rages. But the deeper mystery isn't just about symptoms. It's about how a monarchy, supposedly built on divine order and rational hierarchy, adapted itself around unreason. France didn't end. The crown didn't shatter. It flexed, bent, contorted. It built legal fictions to keep the illusion alive. Because sometimes power doesn't vanish with madness. Sometimes it adapts to it, absorbs it, wraps it in ceremony and keeps going. And Charles's story in that way is the blueprint for something darker. A state so invested in symbolism, it would rather function through a broken vessel than admit it needs repair. Which brings us, inevitably, to England, where a boy king named Henry would inherit the throne, and 13 years later would simply stop speaking. 2. Henry VI. Henry VI didn't explode into madness the way Charles VI did. There was no sword suddenly drawn in the sunlight. No dramatic moment where the king turned on his own men like a cracked mirror reflecting something else. Henry's collapse was quieter, which, honestly, is sometimes worse. Because when a king breaks loudly, the court panics. When a king breaks silently, the court moves in. Henry VI became King of England at 9 months old. That's not a metaphor. He was an infant. A royal baby swaddled in velvet while grown men made decisions in his name, smiling politely as if this was normal. England, of course, pretended it was normal, because monarchy is basically a national commitment to pretending. Henry inherited not only England, but the ongoing catastrophe of the 100 Years' War. The crown sat on his head like an heirloom too heavy for his neck. He was raised gentle, devout, soft-spoken, more monk than monarch, the kind of boy who would rather found a college than lead an army. And England, being England, needed the opposite. His reign was defined by a strange contradiction. A king who wanted peace, surrounded by men who needed conflict. A king who believed in virtue, surrounded by nobles who believed in opportunity. Henry grew into adulthood with an almost painful sweetness. Chroniclers described him as pious, mild, forgiving. He avoided confrontation. He avoided bloodshed. He avoided decision-making, which is a risky hobby when you are literally the government. But for a while, it worked. Or rather, it seemed to, until it didn't. By the early 1450s, England was unraveling. The war in France was collapsing. Normandy was lost. Gascony followed. The treasury was empty. Nobles were furious. The court was factional. The king's marriage to Margaret of Anjou brought political tension rather than stability. Everyone was watching the throne like wolves watching a gate that might not be locked. And then in 1453, something happened inside Henry that no parliament could legislate away. He stopped. That's the only word that fits. Henry entered a state so profound that contemporaries struggled to describe it. He became withdrawn, unresponsive. He did not speak. He did not react. He did not seem to recognize people around him. He was physically present, but mentally absent. A king-shaped vacancy. It lasted for months. The timing could not have been worse, which is almost funny in the bleak way history enjoys. At the exact moment Henry's mind went dark, his wife gave birth to a son, the long-awaited heir. The court brought the infant prince to Henry, hoping the sight of his child would spark something. Henry stared. Nothing. No blessing, no smile, no acknowledgement. It was as if the royal line had produced an heir for a man who was no longer there to care. This wasn't just personal tragedy. It was constitutional disaster. Because medieval monarchy didn't have a user manual for this. There was no checkbox for king temporarily unreachable. There was no official procedure for sovereign experiencing profound mental absence. So the nobles did what nobles always do in a crisis. They argued. The Duke of York, Richard Plantagenet, positioned himself as protector of the realm. Margaret of Anjou resisted fiercely, unwilling to let the York faction take control. The court split into camps, each claiming loyalty to the king while sharpening knives behind their backs. Henry's illness became a political object, not something to heal, something to use. Modern historians debate what exactly happened to Henry in 1453. Some suggest an acute psychotic episode. Others suggest catatonia-like withdrawal. Some propose severe depressive collapse under unbearable stress. And many historians wisely prefer not to pin a modern label on a medieval mind. The safest truth is also the most chilling. Henry became incapable of ruling, and everyone noticed. Unlike Charles VI, whose breakdowns were dramatic and episodic, Henry's crisis was like a slow extinguishing. He wasn't raging. He wasn't attacking courtiers. He wasn't shouting about betrayal. He was simply gone, which, in a way, made it harder to mythologize. A silent king doesn't inspire romantic madness stories. He inspires power grabs. When Henry eventually recovered, because yes, he did, partially, the damage was irreversible. The court had already learned something it could never unlearn. England could function without him. That realization is lethal to monarchy, because the entire system depends on the illusion that the king is essential. Henry's recovery was uneven. He could speak again, could engage again, but the stability was cracked. The factions were entrenched. The distrust was permanent. Margaret became more aggressive in protecting her son's claim. York became more determined. Parliament became a battleground. Nobles began to treat the crown less like divine order and more like a prize in a very expensive argument. And soon, England slid into the Wars of the Roses. It's tempting to frame Henry's illness as the cause, but history is rarely that simple. Henry's breakdown was not a single domino. It was more like someone revealing that the entire structure was already unstable. His mind faltered, and the realm's fractures widened instantly because they were already there. His gentleness, once praised, became weakness. His piety, once admired, became passivity. His inability to impose authority became a vacuum where violence could breed. And the tragedy is that Henry himself seemed almost too fragile for the role. He was not built for ruthless politics. He was a man who might have been happy in a quiet monastery library, copying manuscripts, praying for the souls of others. Instead, he was a crown pinned onto a nervous system that could not bear it. He spent later years drifting in and out of effective control. He was deposed, restored briefly, then deposed again. His reign became a tug-of-war between factions who spoke his name like a spell while ignoring the man himself. There's something unbearably sad about Henry VI, not because he was dramatic, but because he was gentle. A king who did not want to be a king, trapped inside the most unforgiving job on earth. And in the end, his story leaves the same haunting question Charles VI left behind, only sharper. What happens when the throne demands a mind strong enough to hold a nation, and the person inside the crown is simply human? England learned the answer the hard way. And as Henry's silence echoed through the corridors of power, across the Channel another monarch would face a different kind of unraveling. Not silence, not glass delusion, but storms of speech, racing thoughts, and a kingdom forced to ask whether its ruler's mind was a private matter or a national emergency. Because next comes George III. 2 monarchs down, 23 to go, and we're only getting stranger from here. Quick pause before we dive deeper. Where are you listening from? And what time is it on your end? Middle of the night? Commute? Hiding from your responsibilities like a 15th century regent? If this descent into royal dysfunction is your kind of bedtime story, go ahead and subscribe. It's the easiest way to make sure you don't miss the next crisis. 3. George III. George III is the kind of king history can't decide how to remember. On one hand, he is the monarch who lost the American colonies, the man whose empire cracked in the most public way possible, like a grand vase dropped in front of the entire Enlightenment. On the other hand, he is the king who lost something else first: time, reality, control. And the unsettling part is that the second loss may have mattered more to Britain than the first. George III came to the throne in 1760, young and earnest, determined to be a different kind of Hanoverian ruler. He wasn't a foreign prince parachuted into England with an accent and a shrug. He was born in Britain. He spoke English as his first language. He wanted to be, in his own words, a patriot king, which is always an ominous phrase in hindsight. At first, George seemed stable, serious, even wholesome. He loved farming, family life, routine. He was not a decadent libertine prince. He was almost boring, and in royal terms, boring is usually excellent news. But monarchy has a way of turning even ordinary pressure into something unbearable. The crown doesn't sit lightly. It presses, it isolates, it turns private strain into public consequence. And over time, George began to fracture. His illness did not arrive as a single dramatic collapse, but as a pattern. Episodes that rose like storms, then faded, then returned. The most famous crisis came in 1788. The king began to behave in ways that alarmed everyone around him. He spoke rapidly, relentlessly, sometimes for hours, as if language itself had become a runaway carriage. He seemed unable to stop. He was restless, agitated, sleepless. He wrote obsessively long letters. He became emotionally volatile. Physicians were called. Parliament watched nervously. The court whispered. Because when a king's mind becomes unpredictable, the state becomes fragile. This wasn't medieval France where illness could be wrapped in divine mystery. This was Georgian Britain, a constitutional monarchy with paperwork, procedure, and political factions who understood exactly what a weakened king meant. The government needed the king functional, or at least convincingly functional. George's condition worsened. Observers described confusion, distress, and a kind of mental acceleration that could not be soothed by royal etiquette. Some accounts speak of incoherence, some speak of erratic judgment. The details vary, but the core reality is consistent. He was unwell in a way that could not be hidden, and hiding was the first instinct. Royal illness is always a scandal because monarchy is built on symbolism. The king is supposed to be the stable axis of the realm, the human embodiment of continuity. A monarch unraveling is not just a medical event. It is a metaphysical insult. The physicians of the time did what physicians often did. They tried everything. Treatments were harsh, misguided, rooted in the medical theories of the era. The goal was not comfort. The goal was control. And in a grim irony, the man tasked with helping George was Francis Willis, a doctor known for managing mental disturbance with a strict regimen, structure, discipline. George did improve. Enough at least that the immediate regency crisis paused. Parliament had been preparing to appoint the Prince of Wales as regent, which would have shifted power dramatically. George's recovery, partial as it was, postponed that constitutional earthquake. But the illness did not disappear. It returned, again and again. Modern scholarship has spent decades arguing over what exactly afflicted George III. For much of the 20th century, the popular explanation was porphyria, a metabolic disorder that can produce psychiatric-like symptoms. It became the neat answer, the comforting answer. The king wasn't mad, he was physically ill. But more recent reassessments have challenged that narrative. Psychiatric historians have pointed out that George's symptom pattern aligns strongly with recurrent episodes of mania, the kind seen in bipolar disorder, alongside later life cognitive decline. The truth is, we may never know the precise medical cause. What we do know is that Britain watched its king become episodically unreachable, and Britain, unlike medieval France, had a political mechanism for that. The Regency. By the later years of George's reign, his condition deteriorated further. The episodes became more severe. His lucidity faded. Eventually, the Prince of Wales did become Prince Regent in 1811, ruling in his father's name while George lived on, physically present but functionally absent. A living symbol. A crown still technically worn but no longer held. There is something profoundly eerie about that arrangement. A kingdom governed by proxy, while the actual monarch exists in the background like a ghost of authority. George's personal tragedy was immense. He was a family man, deeply attached to Queen Charlotte. He was devoted to routine, order, stability, and his mind betrayed him. He reportedly experienced periods of profound confusion. By the end, he was blind, frail, and lost in a private darkness that no ceremony could penetrate. And the court continued. That's always the coldest part. The court continues. The machinery of power doesn't stop to mourn the person inside the crown. It simply reroutes around them, like water around a stone. George III's illness reshaped British politics. It accelerated debates about constitutional monarchy. It exposed the uncomfortable truth that the sovereign was not, in fact, divine stability made flesh. He was a man who could break, and Britain's empire, already straining under global pressures, now had to confront a quieter instability at its center, the uncertainty of the royal mind. There's a bleak humor in the way history remembers George. He is often reduced to a caricature, the mad king who lost America, but that label is lazy. Because what George's story really reveals is something darker. Even in the Age of Enlightenment, with parliaments and philosophers and rational government. The fate of millions could still hinge on the fragile chemistry of one human brain. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that George's suffering became almost administrative, managed, legislated, turned into procedure. A king's mind collapses and Parliament drafts paperwork. That is modernity in a nutshell. And George was not the only monarch in this era to slip into the shadowed space between throne and incapacity. Across the sea in Portugal, another sovereign would descend into a long darkness. A queen whose grief, devotion, and unraveling would become inseparable from the fate of an empire. Because next comes Maria I, and her court would learn that sometimes the crown does not crack with noise. Sometimes it simply sinks, slowly, into silence. 4. Maria I. Maria I of Portugal was born into a world of formality, liturgy, and structure. Every movement of her childhood was choreographed, every glance observed, every thought assumed to serve a divine plan. She was born a princess, raised a queen, and expected to carry the sacred weight of empire with the effortless dignity of a marble statue. But marble doesn't grieve, and Maria, unlike the statues around her, did not survive uncracked. She ruled a kingdom that stretched far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, with its vast colonial network, was not just a European kingdom, but a global one. The empire included Brazil, African ports, and Asian enclaves. She was the first woman to rule Portugal in her own name. She ascended the throne in 1777, following the death of her father, King José I, and for a brief time, her reign shone with rational order. She reversed some of her father's absolutist policies. She dismissed the powerful and controversial prime minister, the Marquis of Pombal, whose authoritarian control had dominated the court. She reinstated traditional privileges for the nobility and clergy. She was devout, extremely so, and saw her kingship as both divine burden and moral test. In her early years as queen, Maria was diligent, focused, and by most court accounts, perfectly competent. A little intense, perhaps, a little severe. But ruling an empire wasn't a task for the relaxed. Then came the deaths. First, her husband, also her uncle, as was often the custom in European dynasties, passed away in 1786. Maria had adored him. His death devastated her. The grief was not performative. It cracked something. But the court tried to absorb it. After all, queens were supposed to mourn. Mourn, and then carry on. Then, in short succession, came more losses. Her eldest son died in infancy. Then her confessor. Then her close advisors. Then her second son, the Infante João, died at just 27. With each death, something seemed to drain out of her. By the late 1780s, observers began to whisper. Her emotional reactions were intense, prolonged, and, by court standards, unsettling. She was said to scream in her chambers for hours. She began to weep at inopportune moments. She would become frozen, despondent, unreachable. And then, sometimes, startlingly lucid again. This was not faint melancholy. This was something heavier, stranger. Portugal, like all monarchies, had no script for mental collapse in a sovereign. There was no job title for Empress in Grief, and there was certainly no medical category available for what we might now call a severe mood disorder. Perhaps major depression with psychotic features. Perhaps bipolar disorder with extended depressive episodes. Modern authors debate it. The terminology is retrospective. But the incapacity was real. By the early 1790s, Maria's condition was impossible to ignore. She would lock herself away for days. Her speech would spiral. She displayed increasing signs of cognitive confusion and irrational belief. Some accounts suggest she believed she was damned. Others say she developed elaborate spiritual fixations. She stopped attending state functions. When she did appear, it was often in a state of distress. and eventually, governance slipped from her hands. In 1792, her surviving son, the future João VI, was appointed Prince Regent. It was not a public declaration of incapacity, but it was a functional one. Maria remained queen in name, but her reign had ended. And so Portugal entered a period of duality. A living queen who could not rule, and a regent who technically did not yet reign. This shadow monarchy would last for nearly 3 decades. Maria's decline coincided with extraordinary upheaval in Europe. The French Revolution, the rise of Napoleon, the threat of invasion, the scramble for alliances, all of it swirled around a court already destabilized from within. And yet, despite her condition, the state held. That's one of the more unsettling elements of Maria's story. A queen could mentally disappear, and the empire would keep humming along. Bureaucracy didn't pause. The colonial gears kept grinding. Ships left Lisbon bound for Brazil. Governors were appointed. Tax was collected. Orders were signed in her name, though she may not have understood them. In 1807, as Napoleon's armies advanced on Portugal, the royal family fled to Brazil, the only time in modern European history that a sovereign state's capital relocated to a colony. The journey was chaotic and dramatic, involving a massive flotilla and logistical nightmare. And in the middle of it all was Maria, ill, silent, hidden, ferried across the Atlantic like a relic. They docked in Rio de Janeiro. The queen was installed in a palace, and for the next decade, she lived in that strange half-life. A monarch in title, a patient in truth. She rarely appeared in public. When she did, accounts say she seemed confused, barely aware of her surroundings. In private, her condition reportedly worsened. She became nonverbal for long stretches. Her religious obsessions deepened, but Brazil built its own structures around her presence. Court life resumed. A colonial society reorganized itself into an imperial capital. Locals began calling her the Mad Queen, though not always cruelly, often with a kind of superstitious reverence. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this arrangement was. Monarchs were not supposed to vanish into illness. Yet here was Maria, the ruling queen of Portugal, quietly enduring a mental collapse that lasted half her reign, while her son governed in her name on another continent. The medical handling of her condition is one of the more eerie echoes of her time. Her physician, Francis Willis, was the same man who had treated George III during his breakdown. Willis believed in structure, repetition, and a sort of moral corrective regimen. Whether it helped Maria is unclear, host. Sources suggest she never recovered. She died in 1816 in Brazil, still queen, still unreachable, still hollowed by something no crown could fix. Her body was returned to Portugal years later, like a royal echo being reabsorbed into its homeland. What do we do with stories like Maria's? They're too sad for caricature, too complex for cliché. There's no flamboyant madness, no erratic outbursts that could be rewritten as courtly spectacle. There's just decay, of memory, of personality, of sovereign agency. Her mind unraveled quietly. Her kingdom adapted around the silence. And in that space we glimpse the cold machinery of monarchy, built to survive its monarchs. And then, of course, there is the question history refuses to answer, the one no diagnosis can contain. Was Maria the first a woman who lost her mind, or a woman who carried too much grief for one? Because after her, we meet another ruler whose own court would become a stage for illness, opportunism, and manipulation. A king whose madness made space for one of the strangest power grabs in European history. Christian VII. 5. Christian VII. Christian VII of Denmark and Norway was born into the kind of monarchy that looks stable from a distance. Cold palaces, polished ceremonies, Lutheran restraint, a kingdom that prides itself on order, discipline, and quiet authority. And then, at the center of it all, sat a king who could not hold still inside his own mind. Christian became king in 1766 at just 17 years old. A teenager handed the crown of a northern empire and expected to behave like a divine instrument of state. The problem was that Christian did not behave like an instrument. He behaved like a question. From early on, contemporaries noted that something was wrong. Even before the throne, he was described as anxious, volatile, emotionally unpredictable. He struggled with social interaction. He was restless, impulsive. Court life, with its suffocating etiquette, only sharpened his instability. Imagine being a young man already fragile, then being placed inside a palace where every glance is political surveillance. That is not a recipe for mental peace. Christian's reign quickly became less about what he did and more about what others did around him. Because when a monarch is impaired, the throne becomes a vacuum, and vacuums invite opportunists, like candles invite moths. His marriage to Caroline Matilda of Britain was supposed to stabilize him. A young English princess, sister of George III, imported into Copenhagen as a symbol of alliance and normalcy. Instead, it became another layer of tragedy. Christian was often absent, emotionally and physically. The marriage was cold, strained, lonely. Caroline Matilda was isolated in a foreign court, surrounded by suspicion and rigid protocol. And Christian was unraveling. Reports from the time describe erratic behavior, sudden mood shifts, inappropriate outbursts, paranoia, periods of deep withdrawal. He could be charming one moment, unreachable the next. He engaged in reckless escapades through Copenhagen, sometimes disguised, seeking stimulation as if the world's noise might drown out whatever was happening inside him. Modern historians have proposed many retrospective diagnoses: schizophrenia spectrum disorders, severe mood disorder, neurodevelopmental instability, perhaps something organic. But the truth remains frustratingly unclear. What is clear is that Christian was not consistently capable of ruling, and Denmark noticed. But here is where Christian VII's story becomes something stranger than illness alone. Because into this unstable court walked a man with a medical degree and revolutionary ambition, Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee was a German physician, hired initially as a doctor to attend to the king. He was intelligent, rational, influenced by Enlightenment philosophy. He believed in reform, in reason, in the modernization of the state. And Christian, fragile and suggestible, became the doorway. Struensee quickly gained Christian's trust, perhaps because he spoke to him not as a symbol, but as a person. Perhaps because the king's mind, chaotic as it was, clung to anyone who offered clarity. Or perhaps because illness creates dependency, and dependency creates power. By the late 1760s, Struensee was no longer simply treating the king. He was governing through him. It is hard to overstate how extraordinary this was. Denmark, an absolute monarchy, effectively run by a physician. Laws were issued in the king's name, but the king was often little more than a signature, sometimes not even that. Struensee became the true authority, and he moved fast. In just a few years, Struensee pushed through hundreds of reforms: freedom of the press, abolition of torture, modernization of administration, reduction of noble privileges. It was an Enlightenment blitzkrieg. Some hailed it as progress. Others saw it as an unnatural takeover. Because courts do not like being reformed. Courts like being fed. And Struensee was not just politically radical. He was personally entangled. Struensee began an affair with Queen Caroline Matilda. The lonely young queen, trapped in an icy court, found companionship and intellectual connection with the only man who seemed to understand the strange prison she lived in. The affair produced a child, widely believed to be Struensee's, and suddenly, Denmark was no longer just dealing with a mentally unstable king. It was dealing with a scandal that threatened the legitimacy of the dynasty itself. Christian, meanwhile, drifted through this chaos like a sleepwalker. Some accounts suggest he was aware at moments. Others suggest he was manipulated, confused, incapable of grasping the political theater around him. The king became the most powerful, powerless man in Europe, a crown on a head that could not fully hold it. And the court factions waited, because they always wait. Struensee's enemies gathered: conservative nobles, the Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, military officers, those who resented reforms, those who resented a German outsider ruling Denmark. They didn't need to defeat Struensee intellectually. They needed to remove him politically. And Christian's illness made that easier, because when the king is unstable, the question of who speaks for the king becomes a weapon. In 1772, Struensee was arrested in a palace coup. Caroline Matilda was separated, exiled. The reform experiment collapsed almost overnight. And Christian? Christian remained king. Of course he did. The monarchy could not admit the truth too loudly. So instead, they quietly rearranged the furniture of power again. Regents and councils managed affairs. The king became ceremonial, supervised, contained. He lived for decades after Struensee's fall, largely sidelined, increasingly isolated. A living reminder that monarchy is not always ruled by the monarch. Christian VII's story is unsettling because it exposes how thin the line is between care and control. Was Struensee a doctor helping a suffering king? Or was he an ambitious reformer using illness as access? Was Christian a victim of manipulation? Or was he briefly, in his own fractured way, part of something transformative? The sources are tangled. Court memoirs are biased. Political propaganda saturates everything. Even modern scholarship struggles to separate symptom from narrative. Because royal illness is never just illness. It is always politics. Christian's mind became Denmark's battlefield. His instability opened the door to reform, scandal, backlash, and restoration. And in the end, the king himself faded into the background, almost irrelevant to the story bearing his name. That may be the darkest irony of all. To be born a monarch, to be crowned, to be called Your Majesty, and to spend your reign as the excuse others use to seize power. And yet, Christian VII is only one chapter in the long royal pattern, the sovereign whose mind becomes contested territory, because next comes Juana I of Castile, a queen whose supposed madness became the most convenient political tool imaginable, a woman whose confinement lasted not years, but decades, and whose story forces us to ask, when history calls a monarch mad, how often is it describing illness? And how often is it describing imprisonment? 6. Juana I of Castile. The world remembers her as Juana la Loca, but titles, especially royal ones, often say more about the people who gave them than the person who wears them. Juana I of Castile was born into perhaps the most politically volatile family in Europe, the House of Trastamara, and married into an even more ambitious one, the Habsburgs. Daughter of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, Juana was not supposed to rule. She was the third child, placed safely behind siblings in the dynastic queue. She was educated, devout, intelligent, and, by contemporary accounts, unusually sensitive. A trait that, in a court obsessed with control, was both inconvenient and dangerous. But then the queue collapsed. One by one, her siblings died or were disqualified. Her brother, Prince Juan, died young. Her sister Isabella died in childbirth. Her nephew followed. Suddenly, Juana wasn't just a royal daughter. She was the future of Spain. It's worth pausing here to consider the stakes. The year was 1504. Spain was not yet a single unified kingdom, but a composite monarchy of Castile and Aragon, ruled jointly by her parents, who through war, marriage, and religious orthodoxy had begun shaping Spain into a continental and colonial power. With the Reconquista completed and the Americas newly discovered, Spain was poised to become an empire. And in that moment of birth, they handed the throne to a woman whom they would then spend the rest of her life trying to disqualify. Because Juana, by accident or design, never got to rule. She was crowned Queen of Castile in 1504 after Isabella's death. But her father, Ferdinand, quickly moved to retain control, arguing that Juana was too unstable to govern. Her husband, Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, also pressed for power, invoking the same language: infirmity, melancholy, disorder. Terms that gave plausible deniability to a coordinated political sidelining. The diagnosis was never official. There was no parliamentary act, no regency vote, just whispers, then instructions, then, eventually, guards. Modern historians remain deeply divided on what actually afflicted Juana, if anything at all. Some suggest she experienced a mood disorder, perhaps depression or bipolar symptoms, made worse by trauma, isolation, and dynastic pressure. Others argue her madness was a projection, a label imposed by two powerful men eager to keep her off the throne. The difficulty is that nearly all our sources come through those men. After her mother died, Juana's grief was intense. Her relationship with Philip had already been strained. Though passionate, it was volatile. There were rumors of infidelity, emotional manipulation, jealousy. When Philip died in 1506, Juana reportedly exhibited extreme mourning behaviors. These, we are told, were signs of madness. But in what world is grief after sudden widowhood, at the age of 27, definitive proof of mental illness? This is where the narrative begins to harden, and where it begins to fall apart. Ferdinand used Juana's mourning as evidence of incapacity. He returned to Castile, pushed her aside, and governed as regent. She was confined to a remote palace, Tordesillas, along with her youngest daughter, under a combination of religious supervision and royal care. The confinement was described as protective, necessary, humane. It lasted for 46 years. That's not a misprint. Juana lived, mostly confined, for nearly half a century. Longer than most reigns, longer than many lifespans. Her name remained on official documents. Her image was retained in ceremony. But her life was reduced to ritualized isolation. A living monarch reduced to a myth inside her own palace. And through it all, the legend of her madness grew. The label La Loca was not widely used during her lifetime. It became popular later as a way to explain or excuse the erasure of a queen. But even in the 16th century, the political usefulness of the label was obvious. If Juana was mad, then the regents were justified. If she was unstable, then confining her was mercy. If she was disordered, then every political move made in her name could be recast as benevolent. It is astonishing how quickly a woman's agency can be rewritten as evidence of illness when her existence threatens male power. Juana's case is one of the clearest examples of what historians now call dynastic pathologization, the use of psychiatric language to justify political control. Every human reaction she had was repackaged as instability. Her mourning became hysteria. Her refusal to remarry became obsession. Her resistance to her father's regency became delusion. Even her silence, reported in later years, was painted not as dignified retreat, but as symptom. We do not know what Juana thought. Her own voice is nearly absent from the historical record. We have letters, yes, but they are filtered, selected, often written under supervision. What we do know is that even when her son, Charles I, later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, came to power, he continued the confinement. In fact, he strengthened it. Juana, Queen of Castile, mother of the emperor, was treated as a permanent liability. And that's perhaps the most brutal aspect of her story, the way it telescopes into a pattern. At every stage of her life, her status was invoked only to justify her exclusion. First by her father, then by her husband, then by her son. Each claimed to act in the name of the monarchy. None allowed her to act for herself. And so she remained in Tordesillas, year after year, a queen without a throne, a name without a voice. Visitors described her in contradictory terms. Some said she was lucid. Others said she was confused. Some said she was deeply devout. Others said she was withdrawn. In all likelihood, she was a human being responding to decades of confinement the way most human beings would, with grief, resignation, and moments of clarity amid an institutional fog. What becomes of a monarch removed from power but never removed from title? Juana was still queen. Coins bore her name. Documents listed her as sovereign. She had not abdicated. She had not been deposed. There was no legal end to her rule, only a practical one. And perhaps that's what makes her story so haunting. She was ruled in absentia, but fully alive. She was displaced, but not discredited. Her confinement was justified not by a trial, but by a diagnosis never formally made. A queen held hostage by the very apparatus meant to protect her legacy. History tends to write women like Juana into the margins, or worse, into caricature. But if we look closely, her life is not a footnote. It is a central chapter in the history of how monarchies preserve themselves, not through strength alone, but through silence, through the selective labeling of dissent, through the use of madness as a seal of legitimacy, one applied with the same ritual care as a wax stamp on parchment. And after Juana, we must follow that label forward, not across gender this time, but across generations, to another Spanish king whose mind, like hers, became both symptom and symbol, a monarch whose sadness overtook his state, Philip V. 7. Philip V. Philip V of Spain was not born Spanish. He was a Bourbon prince, grandson of Louis XIV of France, selected, groomed, and installed by Europe's great dynastic machinery. A political transplant, rooted more in genealogy than geography. When the childless Charles II of Spain died in 1700, leaving behind no heir and a kingdom riddled with dysfunction, Europe held its breath. The Habsburg line had sputtered out. A new line had to begin. So began the War of the Spanish Succession, a polite-sounding name for a continent-wide brawl over who got to rule what. Amid this diplomatic carnage, Philip, barely 17, was declared King of Spain. His coronation wasn't just the start of a new reign, it was the start of a new dynasty. The Bourbons would replace the Habsburgs, and the future of Spain would pivot around a young man known more for his lineage than his personality. But even at the outset, there were signs. He was described as shy, devout, awkward in public, reluctant in speech. Courtiers found him difficult to read, not because he was inscrutable, but because he was inconsistent. Prone to melancholy, easily fatigued, and emotionally fragile, Philip carried the crown as though it might bruise him. At first, Spain hoped it was just nerves, a teenager thrust into power. Surely he would grow into the role. Instead, he unraveled under it. What began as diffidence deepened into something heavier. Episodes of despair, irrational fears, mood swings, long stretches of passivity broken by bursts of impulsivity, chronic insomnia, compulsive rituals, periods of near catatonic withdrawal. One ambassador reported that Philip could spend hours staring at the floor, unmoving, unreachable, and all of this, crucially, happened in view of the state. Spain had no margin for royal fragility. The kingdom was battered from war, weakened by years of Habsburg decline, and reliant on the authority of its new monarch to stabilize the realm. Instead, ministers found themselves governing around Philip, trying to keep up appearances while managing a court increasingly shaped by the king's moods. Behind the gilded doors of Madrid's palaces, something like a strange performance took shape. A kingdom ruled by a monarch whose internal world was increasingly divorced from external events. But even as his behavior became more erratic, Philip remained central to the Bourbon project. His reign was not symbolic. It was functional, but barely. His wife, Maria Louisa of Savoy, played a crucial stabilizing role during this time. She acted as intermediary, motivator, emotional anchor. When she died in 1714, Philip's descent accelerated. By the accounts of his physicians and ministers, he plunged into despair. Not mourning, not political retreat, something closer to paralysis. The court panicked. Enter Elisabetta Farnese, his second wife, chosen quickly, strategically, and with little subtlety. She was strong-willed, pragmatic, and utterly uninterested in ornamentation. Elisabetta became, in essence, co-ruler, and sometimes more than that. She managed Philip with the focus of a caretaker and the determination of a politician. But even she couldn't keep the structure upright indefinitely. In 1724, after 24 years on the throne, Philip did something no Spanish king had done before. He abdicated. Formally, he transferred power to his son, Louis I. Informally, he stepped back into a cocoon of religious practice, solitude, and increasing disconnection. The abdication shocked Europe. Kings didn't quit. The divine right didn't have an exit clause. And yet Philip walked away, not with celebration, but with fatigue. His court described him as exhausted. What they meant was incapacitated. But the withdrawal was short-lived. Within a year, Louis I, the young new king, died suddenly of smallpox. The line of succession crumbled again. Spain, unwilling to plunge into another succession crisis, turned back to Philip. He returned to the throne. But he did not return whole. From this point forward, the reign of Philip V became something like a long, painful accommodation. Ministers began taking on increasing authority. Decisions were delayed, erratic, or filtered through layers of court mediation. Religious obsession deepened. Reports describe Philip refusing to change clothes, eating erratically, muttering to himself during long nights of sleepless pacing. He developed what many modern writers have described as classic signs of major depressive disorder, with speculation around bipolarity, obsessive-compulsive features, and possible neurological comorbidity. The medical language of the time, of course, had no such categories. They used words like melancholia, tristeza profunda, debilidad de ánimo. But the effect was unmistakable. Spain had a monarch whose mind was under siege. And still, he ruled. That's the part history tends to gloss over. Philip V didn't just suffer. He governed while suffering. He signed decrees, appointed viceroys, maintained colonial administration. He made war. He negotiated peace. He rebuilt institutions, all while fighting a battle no one else could see. And this duality, sovereign and patient, is what makes his reign so haunting. He was, at once, the engine of empire and its most vulnerable component. Contemporary diplomats noted the contradiction. Foreign observers were baffled by the gap between Philip's public actions and private dysfunction. They described a court of shadows. Ministers making decisions in the king's name, Elisabetta steering policy while managing her husband's decline, courtiers pretending not to notice when the king spoke to no one for days. What they saw was not a mad king. They saw a tired one deeply worn down by expectation, grief, and an inherited system that required performance long after capacity faded. Because that's what royal mental illness often looked like. Not chaos, but absence. Not explosion, but implosion. Philip's final years were marked by retreat. His religious rituals became more intense, his sense of guilt more pronounced. He saw the devil in shadows, sought forgiveness through repetition, and feared damnation with the same intensity he once feared diplomatic failure. And yet, even in this fragile state, his legacy was being cemented. The Bourbon dynasty survived. The succession held. Spain remained intact, if not vibrant. The monarchy endured, even as the monarch frayed. He died in 1746, having ruled for almost half a century. What remains of Philip V in the historical imagination is strangely muted. He's remembered as a founder of a dynasty, not as a man who struggled. The label of melancholy appears in footnotes. The possibility of mental illness is acknowledged, then swiftly redirected into political summary. But look closely, and the signs are everywhere. A monarch too overwhelmed to rule consistently, yet too essential to remove. A court that tiptoed around fragility while pretending it was stability. Philip V's reign forces the question. What happens when a monarchy becomes a care facility in all but name? When the throne is not a symbol of strength, but of endurance, by the sovereign and by everyone orbiting him. And if power is supposed to belong to the mind, what happens when the mind slips, but the power doesn't? If Philip's decline was slow and sorrowful, the monarch who followed him in this gallery of broken crowns would spiral faster. His fall would not be quiet. Ferdinand VI. 8. Ferdinand VI. Ferdinand VI, son of Philip V and Maria Luisa of Savoy, inherited the Spanish crown in 1746, but he did not inherit the strength to carry it for long. He came to power not as a warrior, nor a builder, nor a reformer, but as something quieter. He was a bridge, a breath between dynastic storms, a brief, flickering pause in the long drama of a monarchy shaped by succession crises, foreign wars, and personal breakdowns. His reign was called peaceful, his temperament moderate, his governance cautious. And yet, like so many monarchs in this gallery of haunted crowns, Ferdinand's legacy is not one of decisive rule or dramatic failure. It is the legacy of collapse, not sudden, not violent, but total and almost ritualistic in its unfolding. It began with silence. It ended in silence. And in between there was grief so deep it hollowed out the state. Ferdinand had never been particularly robust, mentally or physically. His childhood was marked by isolation and instability. He was the prince raised in a household already fraying under the weight of his father's emotional volatility. Philip V's chronic melancholy dominated the court, and young Ferdinand was shaped under the long shadow of a father who ruled through suffering and a stepmother, Elizabeth Farnese, who wielded power with calculated force. He was not close to his stepbrothers. He was not close to his half-siblings. He was not, by many accounts, close to anyone, except for his wife, Queen Barbara of Portugal. And that is where the story truly begins. Because Barbara was not just his queen, she was his world. She had been married to Ferdinand in 1729, part of a grand double marriage arrangement between Spain and Portugal. These kinds of dynastic pairings were typically political in nature, indifferent to emotional chemistry. But against the odds, Ferdinand and Barbara formed a genuine bond, unusually strong by royal standards and almost obsessively close. They were inseparable, not just in public, but in the daily mechanics of their lives. She was his companion, his advisor, his emotional compass. Foreign diplomats noted the intensity of their relationship with a mix of amusement and concern. The king and queen dined together alone, spent long hours in private, and seemed almost sealed off from the traditional rhythms of court. This wasn't scandalous. It was simply strange, unusual, too complete. And therein lay the danger. Because when a monarch concentrates their emotional universe into one person, the loss of that person becomes not just personal, but constitutional. In 1758, Barbara fell ill. The court physicians attempted everything, but medicine in the 18th century often amounted to elaborate failure. She worsened. The king grew frantic. He slept irregularly. He refused to leave her side. He wept openly in front of the staff, violating every code of royal detachment. And then she died. And Ferdinand disappeared. Not literally. He remained in Spain. His name remained on decrees. His figure remained in court ceremony. But his mind left the building. At first, it seemed like grief. Understandable. Expected. A mourning period. A pause. But it didn't stop. He withdrew almost completely from governance. He isolated himself from advisors. He stopped attending meetings. He stopped issuing orders. He began to eat erratically. His sleep patterns fractured. He walked for hours alone. He stared into space. He talked to no one. He refused to be comforted. There were no outbursts, no theatrical displays, just a steady, corrosive descent. His ministers began quietly taking over. They handled affairs of state without explicit royal instruction, using memoranda and routines to simulate continuity. Spain's administrative machinery, already well developed, continued to operate, like a ship whose captain has vanished below deck, but which still moves because the current is strong. Ferdinand's grief deepened into something else, something harder to define. It wasn't just sadness, it was detachment, dislocation, a kind of psychological corrosion that modern observers might describe as major depressive disorder with catatonic features, but which contemporaries had no name for beyond tristeza real, royal sorrow. In 1759, just a year after Barbara's death, Ferdinand was no longer able to function at all. He retreated to Villaviciosa de Odon, a royal residence outside Madrid. There, he lived in near-complete seclusion. Court records describe him as unkempt, silent, and unaware of his surroundings. He sometimes refused food. He did not speak. He responded slowly, if at all, to basic questions. Attempts at encouragement were met with blankness. The official language used to describe this period was evasive. Illness, fatigue, devotion to God. Ministers avoided direct references to mental breakdown, not because they didn't believe it, but because they had no idea what to do with it. The king was alive. The king was sovereign. But the king was gone. At Villaviciosa, the royal household became something between a court and a care ward. Physicians visited. Priests prayed. Courtiers whispered. Government waited and waited. Eventually, the state moved to finalize the inevitable. Ferdinand had no children. The next in line was his half-brother, Charles, then King of Naples and Sicily. Spain sent word. By the time Charles arrived in Spain to assume the throne, Ferdinand was beyond communication. His decline had passed from emotional into physical. His body was failing. His mind had already left. He died in August 1759. And Spain, quietly, without ceremony, moved on. There was no scandal, no coup, no parliamentary crisis. Just the smooth handover of power from a king whose mind had disappeared to one whose body could fill the throne again. Ferdinand VI is often forgotten in the sweep of Spanish royal history. Overshadowed by his father's madness, his brother's reforms, his successor's catastrophes. But there is something uniquely unsettling about his reign. He wasn't unstable in a theatrical way. He didn't provoke war or scandal or tabloid sensation. He didn't lash out. He simply stopped. And that kind of mental collapse, quiet, slow, unrecoverable, is harder for history to dramatize, but more humanly devastating. Because it reminds us that kings don't just lose their minds through violence or delusion. Sometimes they just grieve themselves out of the world. The lesson of Ferdinand VI isn't political, it's personal. The human cost of monarchy isn't just borne by subjects, it's borne by the monarch themselves, especially when their emotional world is forced to carry both personal pain and the symbolic weight of a nation. And after Ferdinand, the theme of royal mental collapse takes a new, darker turn. Because next comes Ludwig II of Bavaria, a king whose mind was declared unfit by people who never spoke to him. A king whose madness may have been real, or may have been a convenient reason to remove a monarch too imaginative for the modern state. 9. Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig II of Bavaria did not go quietly. He did not grieve himself out of the world, nor retreat into mute resignation. His decline was not slow and unseen. No, his collapse, if it was a collapse at all, came in full operatic color, surrounded by candlelight, swans, and the sound of Wagner's orchestras echoing through palaces that looked more like hallucinations than homes. He is one of the most famous mad kings in European history, and also one of the most difficult to diagnose. Because with Ludwig, the line between madness and myth was never clear. He was born in 1845, heir to the Kingdom of Bavaria, a small but symbolically important state in the loose quilt of the German Confederation. His upbringing was rigid, formal, cold. His father, King Maximilian II, was emotionally distant, and the court was a place of strict Catholic piety, scholarly pressure, and no room for eccentricity. Ludwig, by all accounts, withdrew early. He preferred solitude, books, and dreams to politics and court ceremony. As a child, he was described as sensitive. As a teenager, imaginative. As a young man, when he became king at the age of 18, his subjects hoped he might grow into his role. Instead, he tried to escape it. Not literally. Ludwig was not absent. He reigned for over 20 years. But mentally, emotionally, spiritually, he drifted further from the machinery of governance with each passing year. He was a monarch who dreamed of fairy tales while the rest of Europe was industrializing. He commissioned castles that looked like set pieces from a medieval epic. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, designed not for utility, but for beauty, fantasy, and solitude. They were, in many ways, palaces of self-exile. He avoided Munich. He resented audiences. He neglected state business. He preferred writing long, poetic letters to composers and architects, pouring royal funds into art projects that spiraled in cost and ambition, and yes, he worshipped Richard Wagner. Not figuratively, literally. Ludwig saw Wagner not as a composer, but as a kind of prophet. He funded his operas, paid his debts, and treated his work as spiritual scripture. It was Ludwig's way of rewriting reality, replacing the politics of 19th century Bavaria with the aesthetics of Germanic legend. This made him a poor administrator. But does that make him mad? The court began asking that question by the 1870s. Bavaria was now part of the newly unified German Empire under Prussian dominance. Ludwig's role was becoming more symbolic, and the more he pulled away from public duty, the louder the murmurs became. He spent extravagantly. He lived nocturnally. He withdrew from ministers. His relationship with reality, already flexible, became more theatrical. He demanded grand performances of Wagner's operas for an audience of one. He dined alone in mirrored halls, speaking to imaginary guests. He conversed with long-dead monarchs. He began to believe he was chosen for something greater than politics, something transcendent, eternal. And still, Bavaria continued. Because governments are often quite capable of working around their monarchs. But the spending was impossible to ignore. The construction projects drained the treasury. The court was embarrassed. The Prussian-dominated German authorities were irritated. And Ludwig, increasingly isolated, increasingly erratic, became more than just a burden. He became a threat, not to the people, but to the image of monarchy. And so they removed him. On June 8, 1886, Ludwig was declared insane. The declaration came not from a clinical examination, but from a psychiatric commission. 4 doctors signed the report. None had spoken directly with the king. They based their conclusions on interviews with servants, letters, anecdotes, and public behavior. The diagnosis? Paranoia, a 19th century category that covered a wide range of mental disturbance, including delusions and megalomania. It was, in modern terms, speculative at best, politically convenient at worst. The deposition was swift. His uncle, Prince Luitpold, was named regent. Troops arrived at Neuschwanstein to escort Ludwig into custody. And here the story turns darker. He did not resist violently. He did not rant or scream. But he did not acknowledge the legitimacy of the declaration. He continued to sign documents as king. He referred to his removal as a crime. His letters from this period are lucid, if emotional. He was moved to Berg Castle under close supervision, and 2 days later, he was dead. The official story is simple. Ludwig went for a walk with his psychiatrist, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden. Hours later, both were found dead in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg. Ludwig had drowned. So had von Gudden. There were no witnesses. There were no guards nearby. And there were no signs of struggle, at least none officially reported. Conspiracy theories erupted immediately. Some believed Ludwig was murdered to ensure he would not contest his deposition. Others believed he took his own life to escape humiliation. Others, still, believed something happened between Ludwig and the doctor. An accident, a fight, a final act of defiance. The truth remains unknown. No autopsy was conducted. No investigation followed. The bodies were buried. The new regime moved forward. Ludwig became, instantly, a legend. In death, he was romanticized, painted as the doomed dreamer, the misunderstood visionary, the mad king who built castles in the clouds. Tourists came to see the places he imagined. His fairy tale structures became national icons. His madness, real or constructed, became folklore. But beneath the legend lies a harder, colder question. Was Ludwig truly unwell, or was he merely inconvenient? In an age of industrial nationalism, he clung to medievalism. In an empire of iron and order, he built with light and echo. In a bureaucracy of men in uniform, he wore silk and velvet and spoke to ghosts. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't incompetent. He simply didn't fit. And that, often, is the more unforgivable crime in royal politics. His diagnosis remains controversial. Some modern scholars propose late-onset schizophrenia. Others argue for frontotemporal dementia. Still others believe he was entirely sane, just eccentric, sensitive, and increasingly cornered by a world that had no place for men like him. What we can say is this: he was declared unfit to rule by people who never looked him in the eyes. He was removed from power without a word of defense. And he died 2 days later in silence and mystery. A king whose mind was judged from a distance, whose dreams were rewritten as delusions, whose story, like his castles, was too ornate to be real, but too haunting to ignore. And Bavaria learned what all monarchies eventually learn. It's easy to call a king mad. It's harder to explain what you mean by that. Because sometimes madness is just the word, is. Power uses when it wants someone gone. And next comes Otto I, Ludwig's brother, Ludwig's successor, a king who never ruled, because his mind was taken before the crown ever touched his head. 10. Otto I. Otto I of Bavaria is one of the strangest kings in European history, because his reign is almost entirely theoretical. He was king for 27 years, and he never ruled for a single day. If Ludwig II was the fairy tale monarch who built castles to escape reality, Otto was something even more unsettling. A king who existed only as a legal necessity, a name on documents, a body behind palace walls, a sovereign in absentia, a crown without consciousness. Otto was born in 1848, the younger brother of Ludwig II. Unlike Ludwig, who became king young and immediately collided with the pressures of rule, Otto's path was quieter. He was not expected to reign. He was the spare, the secondary prince, the one who could live politely in the background while his brother carried the kingdom's symbolic weight. But history, as always, enjoys rearranging dynasties. Otto served in the military during the Austro-Prussian War and the Franco-Prussian War. He witnessed brutality, collapse, national humiliation, and the kind of industrial-scale modern conflict that shattered the romantic ideals Ludwig clung to. And somewhere in those years, Otto began to break. The sources are cautious, but the pattern is clear. By the 1870s, Otto was displaying signs of severe psychiatric disturbance. He became withdrawn, erratic, increasingly isolated. Reports describe hallucination-like experiences, paranoia, profound depression, and disorganized behavior. He was eventually diagnosed with melancholia, and later with more severe categories that, in modern terms, might suggest schizophrenia spectrum illness or neurological disease. But as always, retrospective diagnosis is a fog. What matters historically is that Otto became incapacitated, completely. He was placed under medical supervision, removed from public life, and effectively confined. While Ludwig built castles and resisted ministers, Otto disappeared into a private world of illness long before the throne ever approached him. And then, in 1886, Ludwig was deposed. 2 days later, Ludwig was dead. And suddenly, Bavaria faced a problem. Because Otto was next in line. A kingdom cannot simply skip succession because it is inconvenient. Monarchy is a machine built on bloodlines, not competence. Otto became king of Bavaria automatically, instantly, absurdly. The king was ill. So Bavaria invented a solution. Regency. Prince Luitpold, Otto's uncle, became Prince Regent, ruling in Otto's name. Officially, Otto was sovereign. Unofficially, Otto was a ghost. The arrangement was eerie. Court documents referred to Otto as king. Coins bore his name. Decrees were issued under his authority. But Otto himself lived in seclusion at Schloss Fürstenried, a palace turned into something like a gilded institution. Guards watched the gates. Servants moved quietly. Physicians monitored his condition. He did not appear. He did not speak publicly. He did not rule. In a sense, Otto's reign was the purest expression of monarchy's strangest paradox. The monarch is essential, except when they aren't. Because Bavaria functioned perfectly well without him. Ministers governed. The regent performed ceremonies. The state continued. Otto remained alive, breathing, existing in a private darkness that the public was not meant to see. And perhaps that is the cruelest part. Otto was not dramatic. He was not mythologized like Ludwig. There were no castles, no operas, no romantic legends. Just absence. He was the king as patient. His illness was chronic, long-term, and largely hopeless. Modern speculation has ranged from schizophrenia to neurosyphilis to other neurological explanations, but the historical record is too incomplete to be certain. What is certain is that Otto never recovered enough to reign. His condition was treated as permanent, and so Bavaria lived under regency for decades. First under Luitpold, then under Luitpold's son Ludwig, who became regent after 1912. By 1913, the situation had become almost farcical. Bavaria had a king who could not rule, and a regent who had ruled so long he was effectively king in all but name. So they changed the law. In 1913, Otto was officially deposed. Not because of scandal, not because of revolution, but because the state could no longer pretend. His cousin became King Ludwig III. Otto remained alive, still confined, still absent, until his death in 1916. A king for 30 years, a ruler for 0. Otto's story is not romantic. It is administrative tragedy. It reveals something unsettling about royal mental illness. Sometimes it is not a dramatic crisis that shakes the realm. Sometimes it is simply a long, quiet removal of the person while keeping the symbol intact. Otto was monarchy stripped to its barest mechanism. A human being reduced to a legal placeholder. A crown existing without a mind to carry it. And Bavaria accepted it, because monarchy is often less about the monarch than about continuity. The state prefers a silent king to an unstable question. Otto lived most of his life watched, contained, protected, and erased. No one asked what it felt like. No one wrote poetry about him. History rarely romanticizes the truly incapacitated. It romanticizes the eccentric, the tragic, the mysterious. Otto was simply gone. And yet his reign forces a brutal question. If a kingdom can function perfectly well without its king, what is the king for? The answer is uncomfortable. The king is a symbol. And symbols do not need mental health. They only need silence. But Otto's story also draws us back to Spain, where another monarch embodied a different kind of royal impairment. Not psychiatric collapse in the modern sense, but profound developmental and medical fragility that shaped an entire empire's fate. A king called the Bewitched. Charles II of Spain. 11. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain was born a king and treated like a corpse. He entered the world in 1661, the last feeble bud on a Habsburg branch long withered by centuries of dynastic inbreeding. By the time he took his first breath, the whispers had already begun. The court expected a miracle. Instead, they got a mystery. He was born small. He struggled to nurse. He didn't talk until much later than expected. He didn't walk properly. He drooled well into adolescence. He had seizures, muscle weakness, and cognitive delays that made him, by every contemporary standard, unfit to be a ruler. But he had the right blood, and that was all that mattered. Because in 17th century Spain, the throne wasn't just an office. It was a theological structure, a sacred order. And God, apparently, had chosen Charles to sit at the top of it. So the court did what courts do best. It pretended. For years. Charles was educated, sort of. He had tutors, priests, advisors, none of whom expected anything from him. He was surrounded by flattery and censorship, his deficiencies cloaked in euphemism. The official line was that the king was pious, gentle, quiet. Rarely does a word like quiet do so much work. His nickname, whispered in hallways and printed in foreign dispatches, was El Hechizado, the Bewitched. And that says everything. Because in early modern Spain, illness didn't always mean medicine. It meant curse. It meant divine punishment. It meant someone, somewhere, had broken the order of things. To understand Charles's condition is to understand that he was not simply a patient. He was a symbol of everything Spain feared about itself. His body was deformed, though accounts vary in detail. Some say his jaw was so misshapen he could barely chew. His tongue was unusually large. He was described as unable to properly close his mouth. His Habsburg chin, the legendary physical marker of royal inbreeding, was so exaggerated that portraits had to be carefully managed to avoid offense. But it was not only his appearance. He had no formal education beyond the basic catechism. His mental capacities, while not non-existent, were significantly impaired. Foreign ambassadors reported that he struggled to follow simple conversations, forgot what he was told, and would often nod along without comprehension. He was said to have the mind of a child, but the child was king, and no one dared say otherwise. The monarchy became a pantomime. Real power rested with regents, favorites, confessors, and queens. The first was his mother, Mariana of Austria, who dominated his early reign. She used Charles's passivity to rule in his name, fending off rival factions with divine justifications and careful political maneuvering. Later, power passed to the Duke of Medinaceli, then to the Count of Oropesa, then to the French party, then the Austrian party. Spain became a chessboard, and Charles was the ceremonial king in more ways than one, unmoving, protected, but largely irrelevant to the actual game. But he was still king, and kings were expected to do one thing above all else: produce heirs. Charles did not. He married twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess reportedly kind and gentle. She grew ill and died young. Charles grieved sincerely by all accounts, but no child was produced. Whispers turned into open theories of witchcraft. The king was said to be cursed. Potions were administered, exorcisms performed. His body was examined by court healers and holy men alike. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was brought in with the explicit goal of solving the succession problem. She too failed to conceive, and she too was accused, privately, then publicly, of being cursed or insufficiently holy. Of course, modern scholars have little trouble suggesting why Charles remained childless. Severe genetic impairment, likely endocrine and reproductive system failure, chronic illness, intellectual disability. But the court couldn't say any of that, so they said demons. The bewitchment theory took on political life. It gave ministers and clergy an excuse to intervene. It allowed the monarchy to reframe its biological dead end as a spiritual challenge. The king didn't fail. He was failed by dark forces. Meanwhile, Spain collapsed. Its empire was already decaying. The Spanish Netherlands were lost. Portuguese independence had been recognized. Economic instability and military defeat were constant. The court, unable to point to any political success, pointed instead to Charles's suffering, spinning his illness into a kind of sacred trial for the nation. But Europe wasn't buying it. The absence of an heir triggered the great international crisis everyone had been dreading. The War of the Spanish Succession loomed. France and Austria eyed the throne. Each had claim, each prepared for war. And Charles, feeble and fading, became the object of diplomatic obsession. His final years were a geopolitical farce. Ambassadors counted how many minutes he could remain coherent. They reported on his sleep, his appetite, his bowel movements. They catalogued his physical decline the way one might inventory the cracks in a crumbling building. By 1699, he could no longer walk unassisted. He had frequent seizures. He was said to have no memory of events from day to day. His vision failed. His teeth rotted. He fell asleep in meetings. He muttered prayers to himself constantly. His skin turned waxen. His weight dropped dangerously low. And yet, he was still king. Because until he died, the fiction had to be maintained. On his deathbed, Charles dictated a will that named Philip of Anjou, a Bourbon prince, as his heir. This act, issued from a bed barely large enough to contain his withering frame, would set Europe on fire. France claimed the throne. Austria objected. The War of the Spanish Succession erupted. Charles died on November 1st, 1700. He was 38. But in truth, his death had been slow, ceremonial, and largely unnoticed, because his reign was a slow unmaking. He did not go mad. He was never mad in the theatrical sense. His mind was not distorted by delusion or shattered by grief. It was simply never fully able to hold the weight placed upon it. He was not a broken king. He was a king born into a broken plan. A monarch not undone by collapse, but created by it. Charles II stands apart in the catalogue of royal madness because his story is not about deterioration. It is about substitution, about how an entire political system replaced governance with a human symbol, and then clung to that symbol as everything else fell apart. He was the king as placeholder, the ruler as ritual, the body as myth, a living emblem of an empire's failure to adapt. And in the decades that followed, other monarchs would be driven not by genetic fragility, but by paranoia, isolation, and the slow twisting of a mind that once held power securely. Next comes Eric XIV of Sweden, a king whose suspicions turned lethal, and whose breakdown wasn't inherited. It was chosen. 12. Eric XIV of Sweden. Eric XIV of Sweden began his reign like many Renaissance princes, brilliant, energetic, and terrifyingly aware that everyone around him wanted his job. He was the first king of Sweden from the House of Vasa to be crowned after the country's official break with the Catholic Church, and he came to power in 1560 already bearing the pressures of a fragile dynasty, a divided nobility, and a nation trying to build itself out of medieval chaos into something more resembling a modern state. But Eric brought something else with him to the throne, something less easily described than ambition or intelligence or reformist zeal. He brought fear. At first, that fear looked like caution, prudence even. The nobles were powerful. Foreign enemies surrounded the kingdom. His own brothers, particularly Johann and Karl, were ambitious, cunning, and not entirely loyal. Eric watched everyone. He listened to everyone, he remembered everything, and he began to suspect everything, which, for a king, is often the beginning of the end. Eric wasn't born unstable. If anything, his early years suggest the opposite. He was unusually well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, steeped in classical literature, politically aware, intellectually sharp. His father, Gustav I, had dragged Sweden into modernity with sheer authoritarian will, and Eric was expected to continue that process, with a bit more finesse, perhaps. But finesse was never Eric's strength. His court was a volatile mix of ideological reformers, traditional nobles, foreign advisors, and bitter rivals. He inherited the throne young, just 26, and quickly set about consolidating power. He challenged the nobility. He introduced reforms. He extended royal authority. He sought marriages with powerful foreign houses, including Queen Elizabeth I of England, whose polite evasions only made him more determined. And all the while, something else was building behind his eyes. The signs were subtle. At first, intense mood swings, periods of feverish energy followed by exhaustion, an increasingly obsessive focus on court intrigue, a growing inability to distinguish criticism from conspiracy. By the mid-1560s, that fear had hardened into something more dangerous. Eric began keeping lists, not of taxes or legal reforms, but of enemies. Nobles he suspected of plotting against him, courtiers who looked at him wrong, servants who whispered. Anyone could end up on the list. Once on it, no one was safe. He began interrogating nobles personally, demanding loyalty oaths, watching for any sign of betrayal. His conversations became monologues. His decisions grew more erratic. He would lash out at his advisors, then apologize in letters laced with philosophical sorrow and divine imagery. He wanted to be loved. He believed he was hated. And then came the Stur murders. It's difficult to overstate how much this event changed the trajectory of Eric's reign, and how much it reveals about his state of mind. In 1567, Eric had 5 members of the influential Stur family arrested. He believed they were plotting against him. He had little evidence, but a growing storm of anxiety and paranoia made that irrelevant. They were held in the castle at Uppsala. Eric visited them, and something broke. Accounts differ, but what is consistent is this. The king, acting without legal process, ordered the executions. Some say he committed one of the murders himself, stabbing Niels Sture in a fit of rage. Others say he merely gave the orders and watched. Either way, the killings shocked the court. This wasn't war. This wasn't even a coup. This was a king killing noblemen on suspicion alone, without trial, without due process, without the consensus of his council. Eric fled the castle afterward in a state of collapse. He wandered the countryside, disoriented and incoherent. At one point he was found wearing peasant clothes, unable to give a clear account of where he was or what had happened. His own guards feared him. His enemies, now fully awake, began moving in. And perhaps most telling of all, when Eric returned to court, he apologized. He tried to resume rule. He wept in front of his council. He begged forgiveness from the families of the murdered men. He called the killings a mistake, a sin, a moment of weakness. He may have believed this, but power doesn't forgive weakness. The nobility, already uneasy, now saw an opportunity. Eric's brothers, especially Johann, began organizing. In 1568, Johann led a rebellion. Eric was arrested, imprisoned, dethroned. His reign ended not in a final battle, but in confinement. He spent the rest of his life as a captive king. There were attempts, half-hearted, quickly suppressed, to restore him. But the political will wasn't there. Sweden had no desire to reinstall a monarch whose judgment could not be trusted, whose mind had turned its throne into a surveillance post. From 1568 until his death in 1577, Eric lived, in a series of increasingly austere imprisonments. His writings from this time are haunting: religious meditations, paranoid reflections, political philosophy that veers between lucidity and obsession. He died under mysterious circumstances. Many believe poisoned, though this has never been conclusively proven. Modern psychiatric historians have, of course, tried to diagnose him. Some suggest paranoid schizophrenia. Others argue for bipolar disorder with psychotic features. Some even consider the possibility of syphilitic complications or neurodegenerative illness. But as always, the language of diagnosis obscures the more immediate political fact. Eric XIV became dangerous not just because he was ill, but because he was powerful and ill. His fear was amplified by his office. His suspicion became law. His paranoia had the force of armies behind it. And that is the central paradox of Eric's tragedy. He might have survived, even thrived, in a different role, in a quieter life, in a less elevated station. But as king, every internal storm became a national one. Every doubt had consequences. Every fear spawned real enemies. He was, in many ways, a textbook example of how royal mental illness becomes regime crisis, not because the illness itself is contagious, but because the crown turns every private fracture into public instability. Eric was not mad in the way legends suggest. He was not a raving lunatic foaming at the mouth and gibbering through the halls. He was something more painful, a brilliant man whose mind betrayed him gradually, relentlessly, and at the exact pace that power demanded certainty. And when certainty failed, the knives came out. Eric's story ends in silence, in confinement, in disappearance. But it forces us to consider how easily suspicion can become policy, and how quickly fear at the top becomes death at the bottom. And yet, Eric XIV was not the only monarch shaped by fear. Next comes Duarte, the First of Portugal, a king who wrote openly about his own melancholy, not as madness, but as a moral test. 13. Duarte the First of Portugal. Duarte the First of Portugal may be the only king in this collection who diagnosed himself. He ruled briefly, just 5 years, from 1433 to 1438. But in that short span, Duarte left behind something no other monarch in this gallery of royal unraveling did: a meditation on his own mind. A document so revealing, so internal that centuries later, historians still struggle to decide whether they're reading a sovereign's confession, a philosophical treatise, or the quiet testimony of a man increasingly at war with himself. The text is called Leal Conselheiro, the Loyal Counselor. On the surface, it's a manual of Christian kingship, a work of ethical and political guidance, rooted in Catholic doctrine and humanist principles. But beneath the formal structure and medieval prose is something more fragile, more disquieting. Duarte wrote about sadness, not the kind that passes, not courtly melancholia in its ornamental form, but something deeper, recurring, inescapable. He described it as an inner weight, a fog of soul. He spoke of fear, hesitation, indecision, a struggle to act, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he was paralyzed by moral anxiety. He used words like tristeza, cansacho, inquietación, sadness, fatigue, unrest, long before modern psychology tried to standardize them. To read Duarte is to read a man trying to philosophize his way out of despair. And he was trying, desperately. Because for Duarte, depression, though he never would have called it that, wasn't just a private affliction. It was a moral failing, a sign that he was not sufficiently virtuous, not sufficiently strong. In his mind, sadness was a temptation, a test sent by God. And if he could not overcome it, then perhaps he was not worthy to rule. He wasn't the first monarch to feel this way, but he may have been the first to admit it. His reign began in the wake of his father's. João I of Portugal had been a towering figure, a founder of dynasties, a conqueror of cities, a builder of national identity, Duarte inherited not just the crown, but the expectation to be like him. He also inherited a fractured court, a tense political climate, and an expansionist vision that didn't align with his temperament. Because Duarte was, in a word, reflective. He was the type of monarch who preferred to read rather than hunt, who paused before issuing decrees, who agonized over decisions long after his counselors had moved on. He was loyal, sincere, devout, and increasingly burdened by the realization that kingship demanded certainties he did not possess. This wasn't indecision in the political sense. Duarte governed. He passed laws, engaged in diplomacy, and administered justice. But the tension between his public role and private turmoil became clearer as time went on, especially in one decision. In 1437, Duarte authorized a military expedition to North Africa, an attack on Tangier. The campaign was championed by his brothers, particularly Prince Henrique, better known as Henry the Navigator, who saw it as a vital step in Portugal's imperial ambitions. Duarte hesitated. He questioned the timing. He worried about the ethics. He feared the consequences. But he approved it, and it was a disaster. The Portuguese forces were defeated. One of Duarte's brothers, Prince Fernando, was captured. The expedition became a national humiliation. The ransom terms were impossible. The court fractured, and Duarte, the king who had approved it against his better instincts, was consumed by guilt. This is where his melancholy stopped being philosophical. It became existential. Sources from the time describe a monarch weighed down by regret, unable to forgive himself, unable to see a way forward. He withdrew from court ceremonies. He became obsessed with freeing Fernando, who was now being held hostage in increasingly brutal conditions. But the price was too high. The Moors demanded the return of Ceuta, Portugal's prized North African port, a trade Duarte's council refused. He was stuck between his brother and his kingdom. And slowly, Duarte deteriorated. Illness set in, fevers, exhaustion. Historians debate the exact cause of death. The plague is commonly cited. But what remains unmistakable is the mental erosion that accompanied his final months. He wrote obsessively during this time, returning to Leal Consejero, reworking its ideas, reflecting on kingship, sadness, and God. One line stands out even now. The king who cannot govern himself cannot be trusted to govern others. It is not clear whether Duarte was accusing himself or warning others. He died in 1438 at the age of 47. His reign was short, cautious, and in many ways tragic. Not because he failed, but because he felt everything so deeply that even modest failures became moral catastrophes in his mind. Duarte's legacy is strangely thin for a monarch. He left behind no conquests, no grand architectural projects, no sweeping reforms, just a quietly administered kingdom and a book. But Leal Consejero remains one of the most emotionally revealing texts written by a European sovereign, not because of its politics, but because of its pain, its searching, its unresolved questions. Duarte didn't go mad. He went inward. He watched himself too closely. He interrogated every thought. He turned his own mind into a trial and jury, and found himself constantly guilty of not being strong enough, decisive enough, joyful enough. And while modern psychiatry could retrofit a diagnosis, dysthymia, generalized anxiety, even scrupulosity, the point is not to name his condition. The point is that he named it, long before anyone else. In a court where monarchs were expected to project divine clarity, Duarte admitted confusion. In a culture that saw royal grief as weakness, he wrote about sorrow as a spiritual responsibility. In a world where kings hid their minds behind ritual, Duarte tried to reveal his one painfully honest sentence at a time. And if Duarte stands apart in this sequence of monarchs, it's because his struggle didn't destroy the state. It didn't bring down the court. It didn't spark a war or provoke a scandal. but it did break something inside him. And after his death, Portugal would watch another king, one not remembered for melancholy or reflection, but for fear. A monarch whose court turned his behavior into whispered rumor, and whose legacy was as much legend as fact. John VI, 14. John VI of Portugal. John VI of Portugal was born in 1767, a prince by birth and a political afterthought by circumstance. He wasn't supposed to be king, his elder brother was. But when his brother Jose died of smallpox, the future rearranged itself with royal indifference, and the crown began its long, reluctant drift toward him. It would not be a clean transition. John lived in the long shadow of his mother, Queen Maria I, the same Maria whose own descent into incapacitating mental illness had already thrown the Portuguese monarchy into a quiet constitutional crisis. By the time John was in his early 20s, he wasn't just a prince. He was de facto the ruler of Portugal, regent in name, caretaker in function, and heir to a kingdom quietly unraveling beneath the weight of dynastic fragility, economic decay, and the violent tremors of Napoleonic Europe. If he was anxious, it was with reason. But here's where the history gets difficult and interesting. John VI has long been a target of mockery. Caricatured in his own time as timid, indecisive, overweight, excessively devout, and socially awkward, he became an easy target for political enemies and disaffected courtiers. His critics, then and now, describe him as paranoid, erratic, possibly delusional, and strangely absent from the center of his own power. But was he mad? That depends on who you ask, and when. Because John VI occupies a strange place in royal psychiatric history. Not quite a confirmed case of mental illness like his mother. Not quite a victim of transparent political pathologization like Juana of Castile. Instead, his reputation as mentally unwell comes to us mostly through rumor, foreign caricature, and the half-lit corners of Portuguese court gossip, which is what makes him so compelling. He was surrounded by illness, maternal, dynastic, geopolitical. But did it enter him? Or did the court simply assume that anyone so politically pliant, so personally odd, and so emotionally opaque must also be broken? Let's begin with what we do know. John's regency began in earnest in 1792, when his mother was officially declared incapable of ruling. He was 25. For the next 3 decades, he would serve either as regent or king under circumstances that no sane person could call easy. Portugal was politically weak, economically fragile, diplomatically vulnerable. The Napoleonic Wars threatened its sovereignty. Its ally, Britain, offered help with conditions. Its neighbor, Spain, shifted between threat and humiliation. And then, in 1807, Napoleon invaded. John, his court, and over 15,000 members of the Portuguese elite fled the country in one of the most bizarre episodes in European monarchical history. The entire government, ships, archives, ministers, servants, furniture, sailed across the Atlantic to Brazil, the jewel of Portugal's colonial holdings, and John ruled from Rio. It's a move that would later be mocked as cowardice, abandoning the homeland, letting a foreign power occupy Lisbon, setting up a court in exile. But it was also, arguably, a pragmatic act of survival. Portugal's institutions remained intact. Brazil was elevated to co-equal kingdom status. Trade continued. Administration functioned. But the move changed John. Or more precisely, it unmasked what was already there. In Rio, John ruled like a man whose world was held together with fraying threads. He was deeply religious, excessively so by most accounts, prone to fits of sudden emotionality, and increasingly withdrawn from political debate. Ministers complained of long silences, paranoid hesitation, and a refusal to make decisions until multiple contradictory reports had been submitted. He seemed to mistrust everyone, including his wife. Carlota Joaquina of Spain was his political opposite, aggressive, ambitious, and unshy about wielding influence. Their marriage was tense. She openly plotted against him, attempted to assert political control, and at one point tried to have him declared unfit to rule. In return, John confined her to the palace. The entire arrangement was more hostage negotiation than household. Reports from Rio describe a monarch caught in an endless loop of fear and inertia. He was said to wander the palace late at night, muttering prayers, avoiding his family. He rarely appeared in public without layers of protective ritual. Rumors circulated that he refused to bathe regularly, insisted on bizarre diets, or believed himself cursed. None of these were confirmed, but they stuck, because they matched the growing image of John as a man slowly slipping into dysfunction, not in explosive ways, but in subtle, administrative ones. And then the crisis reversed itself. In 1821, pressured by liberal revolutionaries back in Lisbon, John returned to Portugal. He left his son Pedro behind in Brazil as regent, a decision that would, within a year, shatter the empire when Pedro declared Brazil's independence. John lost the jewel of his realm and could do nothing but accept it. Back in Lisbon, he faced an even more chaotic court. Factions pulled in all directions. The Constitution was rewritten. Absolutists plotted. Liberals pushed. His wife continued to undermine him. His other son, Miguel, would soon lead a failed absolutist rebellion. And John VI, quiet, careful, watchful, became again less a sovereign than a figurehead, a symbol of inaction, a placeholder for what the court could no longer imagine, a monarchy with real stability. He died in 1826. The official cause, a sudden illness. But within days, rumors of poisoning spread, likely planted by Carlota Joaquina's supporters or by one of the many factions who saw advantage in chaos. Some modern medical historians have examined the evidence and floated neurological conditions. A possible stroke, late-stage complications of chronic illness, even acute stress collapse. Others look backward and wonder whether he had been ill all along. Not physically, mentally. There are no medical records to confirm a diagnosis. No regency was declared. No public proclamation of incapacity was made. And yet John VI appears in many lists of mad monarchs. Not because of a clinical case, but because of vibe. That's the problem with court rumor. It fills silence with stories. And John VI was mostly silence. Not madness. Not brilliance. Just a long, slow absence. An empire unraveling in slow motion. A family collapsing into factions. And a monarch who seemed to float through it all, untouched, unresponsive, or simply unable to move. He was not Charles VI of France, screaming about glass bones. He was not Eric XIV, executing nobles in a panic. He was not Ludwig II, dreaming himself into fairy tale oblivion. John VI is remembered as passive, but perhaps the deeper tragedy is that he may not have been passive at all. He may have been trying, very quietly, very carefully, to hold together something that was already broken. His mind might not have failed. It may simply have been too slow, too uncertain, too private for the speed of political disintegration. And in the end, whether he was mad or not, mattered less than the fact that everyone around him acted like he was. Which leads us, inevitably, to another monarch whose internal life has been endlessly speculated, dissected, and pathologized, though perhaps unfairly. Mary I of England. Because sometimes all it takes to be called unstable is grief. 15. Mary I of England. She was called Bloody Mary, a nickname so vivid, so cinematic, that it nearly drowned out everything else about her. Not Queen Mary, not Mary Tudor, just bloody, as if her entire reign could be condensed into one word of condemnation, as if blood alone could explain the complexity of her life, her grief, and the psychological toll of wearing a crown weighted with contradiction. But beyond the fire and fury, beyond the Protestant bonfires and Catholic backlash, lies a different question, one that's haunted historians for centuries. Was Mary I of England mentally unwell, or was she just deeply human in a court that treated human emotion as heresy? To understand how that question even exists, we have to start at the beginning. With a girl born into glory, raised in precarity, and ultimately crowned in a world that no longer had room for her dreams. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a pairing that began as a dynastic triumph and ended in a theological explosion. When Henry broke from Rome to annul his marriage to Catherine and Mary Anne Boleyn, Mary's world collapsed. Once the apple of her father's eye, she was declared illegitimate, barred from court, and reduced to something halfway between prisoner and political embarrassment. She was 17. This exile wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Her mother, devout to the point of martyrdom, refused to yield. Mary inherited that same ironclad Catholicism, but unlike her mother, she would one day have the means to act on it. But not before breaking first. By the time her half-brother Edward VI took the throne, Mary was an anomaly, a royal woman, past marriageable age, fiercely Catholic in a Protestant court, and emotionally shaped by 2 decades of humiliation. She watched as Edward's advisors eroded her influence, restricted her movements, and discussed her fate as though she were already dead. And then Edward did die, and the crown tried to skip her entirely. The brief, desperate attempt to install Lady Jane Grey failed. Mary gathered support, marched to London, and took the throne. For one brief moment, she was victorious. She was queen, not the consort of a king, a queen regnant with full authority. But the girl who had waited her entire life for this moment didn't arrive whole, because Mary, even in triumph, was brittle. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was a political necessity, but it was also a source of psychological unraveling. Philip was distant, politically cautious, and emotionally unavailable. Mary adored him, and when he left England after their marriage, she began to disintegrate. Then came the pregnancies, at least the appearance of pregnancy. In 1554, Mary announced she was expecting. The court prepared. The public waited. Her abdomen swelled. She retreated in anticipation of birth. And then, nothing. No baby, no explanation, just silence, embarrassment, and an abrupt return to business. It happened again in 1557. Both were false pregnancies, or, as modern medicine would describe them, pseudocysis. A condition where the body mimics pregnancy symptoms in the absence of a fetus, often as a result of intense psychological strain, hormonal imbalance, or emotional trauma. For centuries, historians have latched onto these events as evidence of Mary's instability. She was, they argue, deluded, desperate, so consumed by her need for an heir, for validation, for divine confirmation of her right to rule, that her mind tricked her body. Others are more cautious. They point out that Mary suffered from menstrual irregularities, chronic illness, and possibly uterine or endocrine disorders, any of which could have created symptoms easily misinterpreted in an era without diagnostic tools. Some argue the pregnancies were fabricated by courtiers, hoping to stabilize the realm. Still others insist she knew and pretended. We don't know. And that uncertainty, in many ways, is the point. Mary's life was defined by the interplay of faith, biology, and power, and all three betrayed her. The false pregnancies weren't just medical, they were symbolic. England watched its queen swell with promise, only to deliver nothing. And in a monarchy obsessed with succession, this wasn't just personal humiliation. It was dynastic failure. The pressure grew. Mary turned inward, and then she turned to policy. The Marian persecutions, the burning of over 280 Protestants during her 5-year reign, are often cited as evidence of fanaticism, cruelty, madness. But this, too, is more complicated than the nickname implies. Mary wasn't the first monarch to kill heretics. Her father had done worse. So had her Spanish ancestors. So would her sister. But Mary burned people in public, and in doing so she turned her faith into spectacle. Some argue she believed England's soul was at stake, that restoring Catholicism required not just legislation but purification. That suffering, both hers and theirs, had a redemptive purpose, that the fire she lit would bring light. But there's another possibility, that Mary, trapped in grief, betrayal, and political isolation, projected her pain outward, that her inability to produce an heir, her rejection by her husband, her loss of health, all became wrapped in the illusion of national sin, that she punished others as a way to punish herself. There are no records of Mary ranting in corridors, or hearing voices, or losing contact with reality in the theatrical way many so-called mad monarchs did. But there is emotional evidence, chronicled in letters, ambassadorial reports, and her own behavior, of someone increasingly weighed down by the gap between what she believed and what her life actually was. She died in 1558 at the age of 42, likely from uterine or ovarian cancer, though exact causes remain debated. She died without an heir. Her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne, and England moved on. But Mary's psychological legacy lingered, because Mary I occupies a peculiar space in the catalogue of possibly mad monarchs. She wasn't incapacitated, she wasn't incoherent, but she was undeniably psychologically fragile, shaped by trauma, driven by belief, and crushed by the symbolic weight of a role she couldn't fulfill. Her mental health, if compromised, was compromised not by illness alone, but by the entire architecture of Tudor monarchy. Her body became a battlefield, her womb a national project, her mind a crucible of expectation and failure. Was she mad, or just mourning? Was she deluded, or simply desperate? And how many queens, trapped in dynasties designed by and for men, were called mad the moment they began to break? Mary Tudor's story is not just a question of mental illness, it's a mirror, reflecting back all the ways power and gender and biology can become indistinguishable from pathology. And it leads directly to her father, a man whose own behavior, once dismissed as autocratic eccentricity, now draws closer scrutiny. Henry VIII. Because if Mary was unstable, where do we begin with him? 16. Henry VIII of England. Henry VIII did not start his reign with madness. He started it with charm. He was tall, athletic, golden-haired, and eager to please. A Renaissance prince in every sense, fluent in Latin, fond of music, dangerously skilled with a lance. England, in 1509, had inherited a king who seemed, at least at first glance, to represent stability after the long, cold anxieties of the Wars of the Roses. He was the second Tudor monarch, the one who was supposed to enjoy peace, not fight for it. But Henry was not built for peace, and he certainly wasn't built for moderation. He became king at 18, and he spent the rest of his life consuming everything he touched, people, wives, churches, land, dignity, until there was almost nothing left but power and pain. Which brings us to the question that refuses to leave him. Did Henry VIII lose his mind? Let's start with what we know. The early Henry was energetic, engaged, and popular. He married Catherine of Aragon quickly, honored the political alliance with Spain, and seemed genuinely devoted to her. He was interested in theology, flirted with humanism, and wrote a treatise attacking Martin Luther that earned him the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith, from the Pope himself. But something shifted. Not suddenly, not all at once, but slowly, over decades, a new Henry emerged. Less curious, more suspicious, less inclined to negotiate, more inclined to accuse. The man who had once been England's golden boy became the monarch we remember now. Bloated, tyrannical, violent, paranoid, and increasingly unpredictable. There are theories, medical theories, psychological ones. Historians and biographers alike have tried to explain the change. One theory centers on head trauma. In January 1536, during a jousting tournament, Henry suffered a violent fall. He was thrown from his horse, struck in the head, and lay unconscious for hours. There are no MRIs, no CT scans, no clinical charts, but there is circumstantial evidence that, after that fall, Henry's behavior worsened dramatically. He became more impulsive, more irritable. His mood swung wildly. He lashed out at courtiers and advisors, executing old friends with sudden coldness. Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Anne Boleyn, each removed when their usefulness or loyalty was doubted, or when Henry's inner compass tilted toward wrath. Modern neurologists have speculated that the fall may have caused frontal lobe damage, an injury known to affect impulse control, emotional regulation, and executive function. In short, the part of the brain responsible for weighing consequences, modulating aggression, and pausing before making irreversible decisions. And Henry made many irreversible decisions. Another theory points to chronic illness. Later in life, Henry suffered from severe leg ulcers, open wounds that refused to heal, often becoming infected and excruciating. The pain was constant, debilitating, and humiliating. He was no longer the gallant knight of courtly fantasy. He grew morbidly obese, unable to ride, unable to walk without assistance. Courtiers complained of the smell. Diplomats noted his temper. Pain changes people. Chronic pain changes them permanently. Add to this the psychological strain of dynastic anxiety. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir wasn't just personal, it was political. The Tudor dynasty was still young, its hold on power still contested. The Wars of the Roses weren't ancient history, they were the recent past. A weak or contested succession could plunge the kingdom back into chaos, and Henry was haunted by that. He watched his first marriage fail to produce a surviving son. Catherine gave birth multiple times, but only Mary survived past infancy. Henry began to believe the marriage was cursed, that marrying his brother's widow was a sin, that God was punishing him. It wasn't just superstition, it was dynastic panic reframed as divine judgment, and so came the break with Rome, the creation of the Church of England, the dissolution of monasteries, the reshaping of English religious life through the lens of Henry's personal and reproductive anxiety. Was this madness? No. But it was monarchy under psychological siege. The Reformation in England wasn't solely about theology, it was also about a king trying to rewrite divine law to match his personal needs. He wasn't crazy, he was afraid. And then came Anne Boleyn. At first, the answer to everything. Charismatic, intelligent, and politically sharp, Anne offered Henry not just hope of a son, but of renewal. But when she too failed to provide a male heir, giving birth to a daughter, the future Elizabeth I, Henry's hope turned to suspicion. Within 3 years, Anne was arrested, charged with adultery and treason, and executed. The evidence was weak, the trial was rushed, but the message was clear. Henry was no longer capable of tolerating contradiction. And this pattern continued. Jane Seymour gave him a son, Edward, and died shortly after childbirth. Henry married 3 more times after that. Anne of Cleves, divorced, Catherine Howard, executed, and Catherine Parr, outlived him. Each marriage played out like a psychological study, test cases in loyalty, betrayal, power, and projection. By the end of his life, Henry VIII was not a monarch in decline. He was a monarch in terminal contraction. His court was tense, his circle was small, his health was failing. He had become the central sun of a dying solar system, everything orbiting him, but nothing able to get too close without being burned. And still, the question lingers. Was he mad? The answer is, perhaps predictably, no and yes. There is no evidence Henry suffered from psychosis, hallucinations, or delusions. His decisions, however ruthless, were often politically calculated. He was, in the words of many historians, a brutal pragmatist, a man who used fear as policy, who understood power so deeply he could unmake traditions with a signature. But there is compelling evidence that his behavior became increasingly unstable. That his mood swings, impulsivity, paranoia, and vindictiveness were not just the products of personality, but of physiological and neurological decline. That the head injury, chronic pain, and years of emotional siege had altered the man beneath the crown. He became less rational, more reactive. Not mad, but damaged. And that damage had consequences. Tens of thousands died in his reforms. His daughters were displaced, restored, and used as pawns in his marital calculus. The church was shattered. The nobility destabilized. A generation grew up under the shadow of a king who could love you on Tuesday and execute you on Friday. And perhaps that's the real danger of unchecked royal mental decline. It doesn't always look like madness. Sometimes it looks like law. Sometimes it looks like doctrine. Sometimes it looks like destiny. But it's really just fear, pain, and confusion, given absolute power and dressed in velvet. Henry VIII died in 1547. His son Edward inherited the throne but died young. Mary reigned briefly, then Elizabeth. Each child of Henry bore a different scar from their father's rule: emotional, political, religious. A dynasty built on anxiety, trying to pretend it was strength. But Henry's story isn't over. Because England was not the only place where power and paranoia danced together behind a crown. France had its own story. A king with elegant manners, and a breakdown nobody saw coming. Richard II, 17. Richard II of England. Richard II came to the throne at the age of 10, which is about 9 years and 11 months too young for absolute power. But history has never been particularly interested in child development theory, and so in 1377, after the death of Edward III and the brief regency of Richard's grandfather, the Plantagenet crown slipped onto the head of a boy. He wasn't just young. He was surrounded by wolves. Advisors, uncles, and courtiers circled him like nobles in a Shakespearean prologue, each with a theory, each with ambition, each imagining the future of England as something that could be bent into shape. Richard's early reign was not his own. It was managed, buffered, stabilized by adults with titles and memories of the long reigns that preceded him. But childhood in a monarchy doesn't last. And when Richard began to rule in earnest, around the age of 16, what emerged was not a second Edward III, the war hero, the tactician, the patriarch. What emerged was a different kind of king, one who believed, perhaps too earnestly, in the divine right of kings, one who did not play well with others, one who treated the crown less like an office and more like a mirror that would slowly crack. If Henry VI's madness came in the form of collapse, and Henry VIII's came with power and paranoia, then Richard II's was something more ambiguous. A kind of performative unmooring, not total insanity, not incapacitation, but an increasing drift from political reality into theatrical sovereignty. Let's begin with his temperament. Contemporaries described Richard as elegant, refined, cultured. He was interested in art, fashion, literature. He spent lavishly on court ceremony. He understood symbolism. He knew how to perform kingship. But many also found him moody, aloof, and petulant, more interested in control than compromise, more likely to lash out than negotiate. He did not forget slights. He did not tolerate contradiction. And he trusted few. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when Richard was just 14, has often been cited as a formative event in his psychological profile. During the rebellion, he famously rode out to meet the rebels at Smithfield, speaking with their leaders, promising reforms, and diffusing a potential bloodbath. For a teenager, it was a stunning act of political theater. But what did it cost? Was it trauma disguised as courage? Did it plant the seeds of a lifelong belief in his own divine role, the king as peacemaker, the voice of God amid chaos? Because as he matured, Richard's behavior took a sharper edge. He began to sideline nobles he distrusted. He elevated favorites, Men seen as sycophants, flatterers, outsiders. He imposed harsh punishments on critics. He surrounded himself with an inner circle that shielded him from dissent. And then came the Lord's Appellant, a coalition of powerful nobles who, in 1387 to 88, effectively staged a political coup, seizing control of government, executing Richard's closest allies, and reducing the king to a symbolic figurehead. For over a year, Richard had to pretend, smile, obey. But he remembered. And when he regained power in 1389, he changed. He ruled with greater caution, at first, reconciling with rivals, restoring a semblance of political calm. But beneath the surface, something had calcified. He was no longer interested in partnership. He wanted control. And then he decided to make it permanent. In 1397, nearly a decade after the Lord's Appellant stripped him of power, Richard orchestrated his revenge. He arrested several of them, had them tried, or simply executed. Others were exiled. Land was seized, titles revoked. Richard had been patient. Now he was absolute. He reigned with an iron calm. Parliament was purged. Taxes increased. Dissenters were silenced. He imposed a new legal framework that made criticism of the king treasonous. He demanded total loyalty. He began referring to his will as law. This is where modern historians start to debate his mental state. Some see these years, 1397 to 1399, as the expression of an autocrat finally unbound. Others see something more pathological: grandiosity, paranoia, disconnection from political consequence. He was convinced of his invincibility. He referred to himself in messianic terms. He believed God had placed him on the throne not just to govern, but to be adored. He began to style himself in robes of gold, required courtiers to kneel longer, spent hours in ceremonial processions, surrounded himself with iconography linking his reign to divine order. The crown was no longer a political role. It was a sacred identity. And then he did something very, very foolish. He exiled his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, after a petty feud escalated into political danger. Then, when Bolingbroke's father died, Richard seized the family lands, denying Henry his inheritance. It was a fatal mistake. Henry returned to England in 1399, ostensibly to reclaim his estate. But he came with an army, and Richard, who had spent the summer in Ireland asserting his control over the Gaelic lords, returned too late. Support for him had evaporated. Nobles flocked to Henry's banner. Towns opened their gates. Richard surrendered without a fight. And here is where his psychological arc becomes most enigmatic. In the final weeks of his reign, Richard seemed to fracture. Some reports suggest he believed his divine status would protect him, that God would intervene. Others describe a man descending into silence, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. Locked in the tower, he alternated between angry outbursts and eerie calm. When pressured to abdicate, he wept, then agreed, then retracted, then signed. Henry became king. Richard was dead within months. The exact circumstances remain unclear. He died in captivity, likely murdered, though officially it was declared starvation. Was it voluntary? Was it punishment? Was it, as some medieval chroniclers whispered, despair made physical? We don't know, but we do know this. Richard's reign remains one of the most fascinating studies in royal psychology. He was not overtly mad. He issued no gibberish proclamations. He did not see demons. He was not confined. And yet, he governed like a man increasingly convinced that his identity as king was not just political, but metaphysical. He believed in kingship the way a zealot believes in sainthood. And in the end, that belief destroyed him. Not because he was wrong, but because he forgot that belief without strategy is suicide. Was Richard II mentally ill? The sources are careful. No medieval diagnosis exists. No physician wrote him down as mad. But his behavior, especially in the final years, bears the fingerprints of something more than political miscalculation. It suggests a man whose identity had become inseparable from fantasy, a man who mistook ceremony for stability, a man who confused being king with being untouchable. And so he fell, not with a sword, but with a pen, a signature on a document that stripped him of everything. And if that isn't a royal tragedy, what is? Yet Richard's fall was not unique. 18. Christina, Queen of Sweden. She was crowned in a snowstorm, which feels about right. Christina of Sweden was never going to be a warm ruler. She was born in 1626, the only surviving legitimate child of Gustavus Adolphus, the military architect of Sweden's rise as a Protestant power during the 30 Years' War. From the moment of her birth, she was more symbol than child. A daughter who was publicly mistaken for a son. The midwives got confused. Raised like a prince, and taught from infancy to lead a kingdom still twitching from religious war and dynastic ambition. Sweden didn't get queens, not as rulers, certainly not as philosophers in wigs. But Christina never asked for permission. From the start, she confounded expectations. She read ancient Greek, wore men's clothes, collected Catholic art while reigning over a Lutheran state, and spoke with the blunt detachment of someone who had realized early that people were less reliable than books. Her court became a magnet for intellectuals, philosophers, artists, diplomats, all of whom were drawn to Stockholm as if it were a snowy Florence. And for a while it worked. Christina seemed brilliant, unconventional, yes, but brilliant. And then came the questions. Why didn't she marry? Why did she walk like a man, talk like a scholar, and treat the Swedish nobility as a barely tolerable inconvenience? Why did she sleep so little, change her mind so often, and veer between obsession and apathy? The rumors began early, that she was unstable, that she had inherited something dark from her father, that the crown sat wrong on her head, that the weight of ruling was breaking her down, that her refusal to marry was more than political strategy. It was, perhaps, a sign of something deeper, something unnatural. Or, in the coded language of royal courts, something wrong. But the truth was stranger. Christina wasn't broken. She was bored. Deeply, terminally bored by the rituals of court, the small-minded bureaucracy of aristocratic politics. The endless expectation that she would reproduce and abdicate quietly into irrelevance. She didn't want a husband. She didn't want children. She didn't want to host another tedious Lutheran ceremony while pretending to care about noble bloodlines. She wanted to think. And so, somewhere around her mid-20s, she began to plan her escape, not just from Sweden, from the identity of queen. By 1654, she had shocked the country by abdicating, the first monarch in Swedish history to do so voluntarily. The official line was that she was tired, sick, and unable to fulfill her royal duties. The real reason? She was done pretending. What followed was one of the strangest post-monarchical lives in European history. She converted to Catholicism in secret, left Stockholm in the middle of the night, and rode south to Rome, the city of popes, heretics, painters, and possibilities. In 1655, she arrived in the Eternal City, was received by the Pope as a celebrity, and proceeded to reinvent herself as a kind of spiritual political philosopher queen. She had no kingdom, no army, no budget worth envying, but she had attention, and for Christina, that was enough. She moved through Europe like a wild card, attending intellectual salons, supporting artists and scientists, negotiating treaties, and defying every gendered expectation still clinging to her name. She became the only woman ever buried in the Vatican grottos among popes and saints. She left behind volumes of correspondence, complex philosophical tracts, and endless speculation about who she was and why she did what she did. And this is where the psychiatric conversation begins. Because Christina's life has become a Rorschach test for biographers, physicians, and political theorists alike. Was she mentally ill? Some say yes, citing mood instability, erratic decisions, explosive temper, and obsessive behaviors. She was known to lash out at staff, retreat into depressive silences, and exhibit cycles of high energy followed by withdrawal. One moment she would lecture a philosopher on metaphysics. The next, she would refuse to rise from bed. Others point to her androgyny and claim it as evidence of identity disturbance, though that usually reveals more about the interpreters than Christina herself. Still others see in her actions the marks of someone not mentally unwell, but utterly uninterested in conventional reality, a monarch whose internal life was simply too large for the throne she inherited, a woman who refused to be reduced, either to a queen or to a patient. And here we hit the epistemological wall. What counts as madness when a ruler refuses every social script? Christina defied nearly every expectation of her era. She refused to marry, refused to reproduce, refused to obey the church she nominally served, and refused to remain in her role once she saw its limitations. She lived without a fixed identity, gendered or political, and reshaped herself over and over in an age when stability was the chief virtue. To call that madness may be convenient, but it may also be cowardly. Her contemporaries were torn. Some admired her brilliance. Others whispered about her instability. Pope Alexander VII once called her a woman without shame, which is probably the most honest compliment ever disguised as a rebuke. Historians have floated every label under the sun: bipolar disorder, narcissistic personality, gender dysphoria, high-functioning autism, depression, even mild psychosis. But none of those quite fit. Because Christina's story isn't clinical, it's existential. She was a queen who refused to be a queen, a woman who refused to be categorized, a Protestant monarch who fled to Catholicism not out of guilt, but curiosity. She burned down the house of expectations and danced through the ashes in pearls and men's boots. Was she difficult? Absolutely. Was she unstable? Only if refusing to conform to a broken system counts as instability. And perhaps that's the point. Because in Christina's case, the accusation of madness reveals more about society's discomfort than her mind. When a male monarch refused marriage, he was eccentric. When Christina did it, she was unnatural. When a king changed religion, it was diplomacy. When Christina did it, it was betrayal. When kings executed rivals, they were decisive. When Christina fired courtiers, she was erratic. So was she mad? Or just disobedient? The historical record can't decide, but it whispers. And somewhere in the Vatican vaults, beneath stone and incense, rests the body of a queen who didn't want to rule, but refused to be ruled. Which leads us, logically and painfully, to another royal whose madness was never a metaphor, never poetic, and never debated. Because if Christina was pathologized for her freedom, then Charles VI of France was imprisoned by his mind. Again. 19. Saul, King of Israel. Saul is one of the oldest names in this entire list, and also one of the strangest, because Saul was not diagnosed by physicians. He was diagnosed by Scripture. His story doesn't come to us through court archives or diplomatic dispatches. There are no medical commissions, no parliamentary debates, no royal doctors scribbling symptoms into notebooks. Saul comes to us through text, through myth layered with memory, through theology wearing the mask of history. And yet, even across 3,000 years, the shape of something familiar still appears. A king chosen, a king crowned, a king slowly undone. Saul was, according to the biblical narrative, the first king of Israel, the man who transformed a loose federation of tribes into a monarchy. He was tall, impressive, outwardly ideal. The kind of leader people could point at and say, yes, that looks like a king. He was an answer to a demand. The people wanted someone to lead them like other nations did. They wanted a crown, an army, a figure to rally behind. And so Saul was anointed by the prophet Samuel, chosen by God, elevated from obscurity into sacred authority. At first he succeeded. He fought enemies. He unified tribes. He carried the charisma of divine selection. And then something changed, or perhaps something emerged. The biblical text begins to describe Saul's inner world in unsettling terms: torment, rage, despair, suspicion. It speaks of an evil spirit troubling him, a phrase that belongs to ancient religious language, not modern psychiatry, but which functions in the narrative as a description of mental disturbance. Saul becomes unstable, not incompetent, not foolish, unstable. He swings between triumph and collapse, between tenderness and fury, between clarity and irrational fear. One moment he is leading armies. The next, he is sitting in darkness, unreachable. The text tells us that music soothed him. A young harp player named David is brought to court, and when David plays, Saul's torment eases. This is one of the most haunting details. The king calmed not by medicine, not by counsel, but by sound. It reads like an ancient recognition that something inside him could not be reasoned with, only quieted. But the calm never lasts. Saul begins to fear David. At first, David is a loyal servant, a talented warrior, the hero who defeats Goliath. The people love him. Songs are sung. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And Saul hears it. And something twists. The king becomes consumed by jealousy and suspicion. He begins to interpret praise as threat, popularity as betrayal, loyalty as conspiracy. This is where Saul's story becomes painfully recognizable to anyone who has studied royal paranoia. Because monarchy is fertile ground for suspicion. When power is absolute, trust becomes impossible. Every friend is a potential rival. Every compliment carries an undertone. Every silence becomes evidence. Saul's fear escalates. He lashes out. He makes impulsive decisions. He grows erratic. In one episode, he hurls a spear at David in a sudden burst of rage. The act is shocking not just because it is violent, but because it is irrational. David has done nothing wrong. Saul's reaction is not strategy, it is impulse. And from there, Saul spirals further. He becomes obsessed with pursuing David, convinced that this young man is destined to replace him. He sees enemies everywhere. He consults priests, then turns on them. He demands loyalty, then punishes it. His court becomes a place of dread. The narrative frames Saul's decline as spiritual failure, disobedience to God leading to divine abandonment. But modern readers can't help noticing the psychological texture beneath the theology. Saul appears tormented by mood instability, rage episodes, depressive withdrawal, paranoia. Some modern scholars have suggested bipolar disorder. Others suggest major depressive disorder with psychotic features. Others argue for PTSD-like responses to constant warfare and stress. Still others warn against diagnosis entirely, because we are reading a sacred text, not a clinical file. And that caution is important, because Saul is not simply a case study. He is a literary figure shaped by moral storytelling. The biblical authors were not trying to write psychiatry. They were trying to write theology, the tragedy of a king who loses divine favor. But tragedy has psychological realism. Saul's downfall is not cartoonish. It is gradual, painful, intimate. He is not portrayed as purely evil. He is portrayed as suffering. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Saul is, in many ways, the prototype of the haunted king. Chosen, elevated, then consumed by forces he cannot control. His reign becomes a slow unraveling, not because enemies defeat him, but because his own mind becomes his enemy. There is a bleak irony here. Saul wanted a crown because the people demanded one. He became king because the nation wanted stability. And the first king they received was unstable. It's almost as if the story is warning us, monarchy does not solve human fear. It magnifies it. Saul's life ends in catastrophe, but we will not linger on that in graphic detail. What matters is the emotional arc. The king who begins with promise and ends with isolation, pursued not only by enemies, but by his own torment. And David, the young harp player, becomes the next king. A successor born from the shadow of Saul's decline, which raises the question that echoes through every monarchy on this list. When a ruler's mind falters, what replaces them? A regent? A rival? A prophet? A new dynasty? Saul's story is ancient, but its pattern is timeless. The king is chosen. The king breaks. The kingdom adapts. And the narrative moves on. Because next comes another ancient monarch, another story of madness, framed as moral theater rather than medical fact. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. A king whose fall is written not in chronicles, but in parable. 20. Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon. There is no medical file, no diary, no confessional letter from a court physician who dared to write what no one else would say. What we have instead is a dream, or rather the aftermath of one. Told in the book of Daniel, set in the vast courts of Babylon, and centered around the most powerful man east of the Mediterranean. Nebuchadnezzar II, King of Kings, builder of empires, and, according to the biblical narrative, a man who lost his mind and lived like a beast. The phrase went mad appears in some translations. Others soften it. He was driven away. He lost his reason. But the image remains. A king who ate grass like an ox, whose hair grew like eagle feathers, whose nails curled like claws. A man who ruled the known world, and then forgot he was human. Now let's stop for a moment and make something very clear. This account does not appear in Babylonian chronicles. There is no surviving cuneiform tablet describing a 7-year reign of madness. This story is scriptural. It comes from the Hebrew Bible, specifically Daniel chapter 4. And as such, it lives in the space between theology, allegory, and possible memory. But history, inconveniently, doesn't always come in certified packaging. It arrives disguised, as story, as warning, as dream sequence. And that's what Daniel gives us. Nebuchadnezzar dreams of a vast tree, stretching to the heavens, sheltering the world beneath it. Then a voice declares it will be cut down, its branches stripped, its fruit scattered, its stump left bound in iron, until the king learns that the Most High rules the kingdom of men. The interpretation is offered, hesitantly, by Daniel. The tree is Nebuchadnezzar himself. He has grown too proud, too vast, too certain. And a fall is coming, one not of armies or rebellion, but of the mind. What follows is one of the oldest and most symbolic accounts of mental collapse in ancient literature. The king is said to have been driven from among men, to dwell with animals, to eat grass, to lose his reason. For 7 times, perhaps years, perhaps an idiom for a long time, he lives like this, until at last he lifts his eyes to heaven, acknowledges divine sovereignty, and is restored. To some this is prophecy, to others parable. But the shape of it is uncanny, because beneath the divine punishment and cosmic lesson lies something strangely human. The story of a ruler who believed himself above all others, who ignored warnings, who crossed the line from greatness to delusion, and who paid for it with his mind. Sound familiar? It should. This pattern shows up again and again in royal history. Hubris followed by collapse, power morphing into isolation, absolute rule giving way to absolute disconnection. So what do we do with Nebuchadnezzar? Was there a real period of incapacitation in his reign? Some scholars have speculated that the biblical story might echo an actual event, perhaps a prolonged illness, perhaps a political eclipse masked as madness, perhaps even the actions of a later ruler misremembered under his name. Others argue it's pure allegory, a theological polemic designed to show that even the most powerful pagan king is nothing compared to the God of Israel. But here's where it gets interesting. The ancient world didn't draw hard lines between madness, morality, and divinity. To be mad wasn't always pathology. Sometimes it was punishment. Sometimes revelation. Sometimes the gods themselves were the cause, a spirit sent to torment or teach. And so when Nebuchadnezzar descends into animalistic behavior, the point isn't that he had a psychiatric condition. The point is that he forgot the order of the universe. And that is exactly how madness was understood in many royal courts. It wasn't about neurotransmitters. It was about cosmology. A king was supposed to be in alignment with the heavens, the people, the divine plan. When that alignment fractured, when arrogance exceeded piety, when the king mistook himself for a god, the result wasn't just bad policy. It was madness. In that light, Nebuchadnezzar's fall becomes a cautionary tale, not about mental illness, but about the political consequences of metaphysical error. And yet, modern readers can't help but see the psychological subtext. Because however symbolic the story, it reflects something eerily familiar. A man once surrounded by absolute obedience, who becomes unmoored from reality, who loses the ability to function socially, and who regresses into a kind of primitive state. In modern psychiatric terms, theories abound. Some have suggested a psychotic break, perhaps triggered by stress, isolation, or latent predisposition. Others propose a dissociative disorder, brought on by trauma or theological obsession. Still others note the striking parallels with boanthropy, a rare and unusual condition where a person believes themselves to be an ox or a cow. Yes, that's a real diagnosis. And no, it is not common. But the point is not to shoehorn the king into a DSM category. The point is that the behavior described, living outside, eating grass, growing unkempt, losing language and hierarchy, fits a recognizable pattern of extreme mental collapse. And that's what makes the story resonate. Even stripped of its religious framing, we're left with a compelling image. The world's most powerful man, undone not by war or rebellion, but by the fragile architecture of his own mind. It's almost too poetic. But then again, history is full of such poetry. Nebuchadnezzar, if he truly fell into such a state, would not be the last ruler to confuse his crown with immortality. He would not be the last king to believe himself untouchable, only to find that reality, or God, or his own synapses, had other plans. And that is what links him to the others on this list. Not just madness, but collapse. A falling away from self. A disintegration of role, identity, speech, presence. He begins as a builder of cities. He ends as a nameless creature in a field. And then, in the story's final act, he returns. The narrative closes with Nebuchadnezzar restored, his sanity returned, his throne reoccupied, his declarations of God's sovereignty louder than ever. It's a tidy ending, a redemptive arc, but we should be careful, because stories that neat are rarely complete. Did the real Nebuchadnezzar suffer a psychological break? We don't know. Did he have a period of seclusion, withdrawal, or erratic behavior? Possibly. There are gaps in the historical record. Was this story added later, shaped by a people in exile, crafting narratives of divine justice? Almost certainly. But whether fact or fable, the story endures, because it taps into a deeper anxiety that every society must wrestle with. What happens when the person in charge stops being a person? What happens when the mind at the center of power no longer functions? And who decides when that line is crossed? Nebuchadnezzar's story answers these questions with divine judgment. But in other courts, it would be family, advisors, generals, or in the next case, a historian named Herodotus, who described another king, one much closer to the Persian heartland, whose descent into madness might tell us more about the storyteller than the subject. Cambyses II. 21. Cambyses II of Persia. Cambyses II has a problem that many monarchs on this list do not. His problem is Herodotus. If Nebuchadnezzar's madness is wrapped in theology, Cambyses' madness is wrapped in Greek storytelling. And Greek storytelling has never been shy about portraying foreign kings as unstable, impious, and slightly unhinged. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, ruled the Persian Empire from around 530 to 522 BCE. He inherited one of the most astonishing political creations of the ancient world, an empire stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia, built not only by conquest, but by administrative genius. Cyrus had been respected even by his enemies. He was the rare conqueror who seemed almost reasonable. Cambyses did not inherit that reputation. Instead, he inherited suspicion. Because Cambyses' story, as preserved most vividly by Herodotus, reads less like a biography and more like a cautionary tale. The king who went too far, offended the gods, mocked sacred traditions, and descended into cruelty and madness. But did he? Or did Herodotus simply need him to? Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, is often called the father of history. He is also, depending on your mood, the father of dramatic exaggeration. His accounts blend observation, hearsay, moral lesson, and myth into a single flowing narrative. He is invaluable and unreliable, often in the same sentence. And Cambyses, for Herodotus, is the perfect villain. Cambyses is most famous for conquering Egypt in 525 BCE, adding the ancient Nile kingdom to Persia's growing domain. This alone would have made him controversial in Egyptian sources. Foreign conquerors rarely get flattering biographies from the conquered. But Herodotus goes further. He describes Cambyses not as a strategic imperialist, but as a man unraveling. According to the Greek account, Cambyses mocked Egyptian religion, desecrated temples, and killed sacred animals. He is portrayed as laughing at rituals, insulting priests, and behaving with reckless contempt for everything Egypt held holy. In Herodotus's telling, this impiety is the beginning of madness. The king becomes erratic, violent, suspicious. He orders executions impulsively. He lashes out at advisors. He is consumed by paranoia and arrogance. He is said to have killed his own brother, Smerdis, out of fear of rivalry. He is said to have spiraled further, ordering absurd campaigns into the desert, sending armies toward impossible goals, ignoring logistics, chasing delusions of grandeur. He becomes, in short, the archetype of the mad tyrant. And then Herodotus delivers the punchline. Cambyses dies in a freak accident, wounded by his own sword, far from home, undone not by enemies, but by fate. It's a perfect Greek tragedy, which is exactly why we should be cautious. Because Cambyses is not just a king in this story. He is a moral lesson. Greek writers loved the trope of the foreign despot, the Eastern king corrupted by luxury, arrogance, and unchecked power. Persia, as the great imperial rival of Greece, became the canvas onto which Greek authors projected their anxieties about monarchy itself. Cambyses is portrayed not merely as cruel, but as irrational, because irrationality makes tyranny easier to condemn. A cruel king might still be competent. A mad king is safe to hate. So what do we actually know? The truth is thinner. Persian sources from Cambyses' reign are scarce. Egyptian inscriptions confirm the conquest and his rule there, but they do not confirm Herodotus's lurid tales of sacrilege. Administrative documents suggest that Persian governance in Egypt was, if anything, relatively pragmatic. Cambyses adopted pharaonic titles. The empire continued functioning. That does not sound like a man entirely disconnected from reality. As for the alleged murder of his brother, it remains debated. Later Persian political upheaval, especially the rise of Darius I, makes the succession story deeply suspect. Claims of madness and fratricide could easily have served as propaganda to justify a new regime. In other words, Cambyses may have been pathologized after the fact. Which brings us back to the central theme of these disputed monarchs. Madness is often politically useful. Accuse a king of insanity, and suddenly rebellion becomes rescue. Deposition becomes duty. A coup becomes compassion. Herodotus's Cambyses is a king who loses control of himself, and therefore deserves to lose control of his empire. But we must ask, is this history or narrative convenience? Modern scholars have proposed medical explanations: epilepsy, psychosis, substance intoxication, but these are speculative at best. We have no clinical descriptions, only literary ones, and literary descriptions are rarely neutral. What we can say is this: Cambyses ruled during a period of enormous imperial pressure. He conquered Egypt, managed a multi-ethnic empire, faced court intrigue, and died, suddenly, at a young age. Those conditions alone could produce erratic decisions, paranoia, and harsh rule, without requiring mental illness. But harshness is not madness, and foreignness is not diagnosis. Cambyses becomes a fascinating case not because we can confirm his illness, but because his story shows how easily mental instability becomes a rhetorical weapon. In Greek hands, the Persian king becomes a symbol of what happens when monarchy loses restraint. In later tradition, he becomes an example of divine punishment. But behind all that storytelling, there may have been simply a young ruler overwhelmed by empire, or a competent ruler smeared by enemies, or a man who truly did unravel under the weight of absolute power. We cannot know, and that uncertainty is precisely the point. Cambyses reminds us that royal madness is not always a medical fact. Sometimes it is a political genre, a narrative tool, a way for later societies to explain cruelty, failure, or cultural difference, without confronting more complex truths. And that pattern will only intensify when we move forward to queens, rulers whose reputations were even more vulnerable to rumor, slander, and psychiatric metaphor. Because the next monarch on our list is Joanna II of Naples, a queen whose enemies didn't just accuse her of incompetence. They accused her of irrationality itself. 22. Joanna II, Queen of Naples. It starts, as these things often do, with inheritance. Joanna II of Naples wasn't supposed to rule. Not really. Not in the eyes of her court. Not in the minds of the men who surrounded her. And certainly not in the way she eventually did. Unapologetically, erratically, and on her own terms. She was born in 1371 to Charles III of Naples and Margaret of Durazzo, a product of dynastic engineering with a troubled political pedigree. Her early life was not the slow grooming of a future monarch, but a parade of marriage negotiations, hostage threats, and passive royal duties. She was raised in a court thick with intrigue and haunted by succession crises. The sort of environment where trust dies early and rumor feeds on every silence. Then, in 1414, at the age of 43, she became queen. Her brother, King Ladislaus, had died without an heir. Joanna, his older sister, was now the only legitimate Angevin left to hold the Neapolitan throne. And so, after decades as a peripheral figure, she was elevated, and the knives came out almost immediately. From the moment of her coronation, Joanna was treated not as a sovereign, but as a liability, a placeholder for male power, a vessel for dynastic transition, a queen to be managed or replaced. She faced resistance from the Neapolitan nobility, interference from the papacy, and the ever-present scrutiny of foreign observers who treated her actions as theater rather than politics. And yet, she ruled. For over 2 decades, Joanna II remained Queen of Naples. How she did it, and what she was accused of along the way, is where our story begins to fracture into questions of mental health, political slander, and gendered distortion. Let's start with the most repeated claim, that Joanna was irrational, unstable, and manipulated by unworthy favorites. Contemporary and near-contemporary chroniclers often portray her as volatile. They emphasize her relationships with powerful male courtiers, especially Sergiani Caracciolo, who rose from minor nobility to de facto ruler during the early years of her reign. Caracciolo was appointed Grand Seneschal and became the object of deep court resentment. Not only did he wield enormous influence, he was rumored to be Joanna's lover. That word, rumored, does a lot of heavy lifting. The relationship was never formally confirmed, but in court gossip, implication is enough. Caracciolo's rise was seen not as meritocratic, but as emotional manipulation. If the queen trusted him, it must be because she was in thrall. If she elevated him, it must be because she lacked reason. This is the pattern we see again and again in female rulership. Power itself becomes suspect, and emotional intimacy is pathologized. When male monarchs elevate favorites, it's politics. When female monarchs do it, it's madness. Joanna eventually had Caracciolo assassinated. In 1432, stabbed in his chambers, allegedly at her command. Was this evidence of instability, or simply the cost of court management in 15th century Italy? Her enemies, predictably, leaned toward the former. By the time of her death in 1435, Joanna had been accused of nearly every classic trope available to women in power: promiscuity, favoritism, caprice, irrationality, and emotional volatility. Some accounts paint her as a puppet queen, others as a dangerous manipulator, others still as a madwoman incapable of coherent rule. And yet, she held the throne for 21 years. So what's going on here? The first layer is obvious: gendered propaganda. Joanna ruled in a political landscape that believed female authority was a contradiction in terms. A queen regnant was not just unusual, she was unnatural. That made her a permanent target. Every decision she made was second-guessed. Every advisor she trusted was scrutinized. Her refusal to marry again, after a politically disastrous union with James II of Bourbon, was treated not as autonomy, but as instability. In short, she was too independent to be acceptable, and too successful to be ignored. The second layer is more complicated. Was there actually evidence of mental illness? Modern historians have combed the sources. What they find is ambiguous. There are no records of psychosis, no clear descriptions of delusional thinking, no reported incapacitation. Joanna continued to attend council meetings, negotiate treaties, and play foreign powers against one another with considerable skill. But the rumors persisted. There are descriptions of mood swings, of erratic patronage, of late-night decisions, sudden dismissals, shifting loyalties. These are taken by some scholars as possible evidence of mood disorder or personality disturbance. Others, perhaps more plausibly, see them as the predictable behavior of a monarch under siege. Consider the political environment Joanna operated in. The Pope was constantly threatening to revoke her legitimacy. The Aragonese and Angevins were both trying to claim Naples. The Neapolitan nobility was factionalized and often violent. Her court was filled with spies, double agents, and schemers. In that context, unpredictability becomes a survival strategy, not a symptom. Joanna played one side against the other, keeping suitors and claimants in perpetual negotiation. She adopted Alfonso V of Aragon as her heir, then revoked it, then reinstalled him, then revoked it again. She considered alliances with the French, then pivoted to local barons. To the outsider, this looked like indecision. To the court insider, it was shrewd chaos management. There is no doubt that Joanna's reign was unstable, but whether she was unstable remains unproven. And that distinction matters, because queens, unlike kings, have historically been read through the lens of emotion. Assertiveness becomes hysteria. Caution becomes indecision. And any behavior that deviates from the docile ideal becomes fodder for retrospective diagnosis. Joanna II, stands as a case study in this dynamic. Her alleged madness is inseparable from misogyny. Her political struggles are reframed as psychological ones. Her autonomy becomes pathology. And yet, across 2 turbulent decades, she managed to keep Naples out of foreign hands, an achievement many male rulers failed to accomplish. So what do we call her? A mad queen? A misunderstood strategist? A ruler who defied the mold and was punished by history for it? Perhaps all 3. Because in the end, Joanna's story forces us to confront a deeper truth. History often uses madness not to describe, but to dismiss. Label a queen irrational, and you no longer have to take her policies seriously. Accuse her of instability, and you can erase her achievements as accidents. Reduce her to scandal, and you don't have to face the uncomfortable fact that she beat the odds. Which leads us, inevitably, to another royal woman caught in the same historical trap. A queen whose political failure became, in the eyes of her enemies, a sign of mental collapse. Mary, Queen of Scots. A monarch remembered more for her tragedy than her mind, and more for her image than her reality. 23. Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart's life reads like a Gothic novel dictated by a room full of hostile witnesses. She was queen at 6 days old, a widow at 18, a political exile by 25, a prisoner for nearly 2 decades, and eventually a royal execution, carried out by her cousin, another queen, who read her death warrant with a sense of grim necessity that only dynastic paranoia could sharpen. But before she became a martyr, before she became a symbol of doomed beauty and Catholic suffering and romantic resistance, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a living monarch. And for a brief, chaotic window in the mid-16th century, she was the single most complicated political figure in Europe. A woman with legitimate claim to 2 crowns, caught between empires, caught between religions, caught between the will to rule and the creeping sense that the world would not let her. So, of course, they called her mad. Eventually. Not at first. Early portraits of Mary, both literal and metaphorical, show her as sharp, charming, intelligent, and diplomatic. She was raised in the French court, fluent in multiple languages, trained in etiquette, with the elegance of a Renaissance aristocrat and the political pedigree of a pan-European monarch. She became Queen Consort of France at 15 and reigned briefly beside Francis II before his death in 1560. Then Scotland called her home, and the unraveling began. Mary returned to a country she barely knew, colder, harsher, and more divided than the polished courts of France. Her Protestant half-brother Lord James was acting as regent. The nobility was fractured. The Reformation had redefined loyalty. Mary was Catholic, young, and foreign-educated. She represented everything the Scottish elite was starting to reject. And yet, she ruled. For a while. Between 1561 and 1567, Mary attempted to balance the impossible: religious diplomacy, factional appeasement, royal authority, and personal survival. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, in 1565, a man with enough royal blood to make the union politically potent, but too much vanity, too little self-control, and far too many enemies. Then came the spiral. In 1567, Darnley was murdered. His house, Kirk O'Field, was blown up. His body was found outside, possibly suffocated, not burned. The investigation was a disaster. No one was punished in any satisfying way, except Mary, or at least her reputation. Soon after Darnley's death, Mary married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, the man many suspected of orchestrating the killing. Whether this was love, political strategy, or coerced submission remains a matter of historical dispute. But the optics were disastrous. A queen, widowed under suspicious circumstances, marrying the accused murderer. Scandal was instant. Legitimacy eroded. The Scottish nobility rebelled. Mary was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son, and eventually fled south into England seeking refuge with her cousin Elizabeth I. And thus began the long imprisonment. 19 years under house arrest, surrounded by spies, forbidden from political activity, with every letter monitored, every contact watched. She was a threat, a living Catholic claim to the English throne, and Elizabeth knew it. So why is Mary on a list of mentally ill monarchs? Because somewhere in this political collapse, a shift occurred. The narrative of Mary's life became one not just of misfortune, but of instability. Chroniclers, propagandists, and later biographers began to suggest that Mary's decision-making wasn't just poor, it was irrational. That her reign wasn't just turbulent, it was self-destructive. That her failures weren't political, they were psychological. And that's where things get murky. Because madness in Mary's case is not diagnosed in the way it is for Charles VI or George III. There are no recorded hallucinations, no catatonic episodes, no physicians declaring her unfit to rule. There is no documented incapacity, no regency, no clinical collapse. What there is, instead, is a sequence of catastrophes, and the suggestion, over time, that only a woman in psychological decline would have married Bothwell, alienated her court, and thrown away her crown. The word hysteria floats behind the pages, unspoken but implied. But was Mary actually unstable? Or was she merely cornered? Modern historians tend to approach the question with skepticism. There is little concrete evidence that Mary suffered from any form of mental illness. Her letters, preserved across years of confinement, are articulate, strategic, and emotionally coherent. She corresponded with foreign allies, negotiated terms of release, and even participated in plots, including, fatally, the Babington plot, which led to her execution. She remained, in other words, politically functional. So why the diagnosis by reputation? Partly it's gender. Female. Rulers who fail are often described as emotional, irrational, or unfit. Even when male rulers with similar downfalls are spared the same framing. Mary's beauty, her tragic love affairs, her dramatic downfall, these made her an easy target for romanticizing and pathologizing alike. Partly it's propaganda. English Protestant writers had every reason to portray Mary as a dangerous, unstable woman, not just a political threat, but a moral and psychological one. The narrative helped justify her captivity. Eventually, it helped justify her execution. And partly, it's the tragedy itself. Mary's life reads like the arc of a tragic heroine, and tragedy demands internal flaws. To make sense of her downfall, later readers searched for signs of weakness, confusion, erratic behavior. The more poetic the ruin, the more tempting the armchair diagnosis. But there's another possibility. What if Mary wasn't mad? What if she was simply crushed, slowly, relentlessly, by a world that gave her a throne at 6 days old and never once let her grow into it? What if her worst decisions, marrying Darnley, then Bothwell, were not symptoms of mental collapse, but desperate political calculations made under impossible conditions? What if the instability wasn't hers, but the world's? Scotland, in the 1560s, was a political grenade. Religious wars, noble rebellions, dynastic conflicts, foreign interference. No ruler, male or female, would have found stability there. And yet Mary is blamed not just for losing her crown, but for losing her mind. And that, in itself, is the most revealing symptom of all, not of Mary, but of history. Because when history sees a queen fall, it reaches for madness. When it sees a king fall, it reaches for politics. Mary's story is not one of medical diagnosis. It is a story of how quickly power is reframed as pathology, of how women in power walk a narrower line, and how once they slip, The world pretends it was always inevitable. By the time Mary was executed in 1587, she was no longer a queen in the eyes of England. She was a symbol, a threat, a lesson. And even then she died with her mind intact, refusing to recant, refusing to bend, refusing to become what the propaganda claimed she was. A madwoman. Instead, she became a ghost, one that would haunt Elizabeth, and Europe, and history books for centuries. But before Mary walked into execution, before the ink dried on her tragic narrative, there was another monarch who burned with instability, not cloaked in tragedy, not softened by romance, but raw, furious, and drenched in the blood of a nation divided by faith. Charles IX of France. 24. Charles IX of France. There is a particular kind of silence that lives in the aftermath of Charles IX. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of rooms still stained with panic, of hallways where footsteps once ran during the night, of courtiers who do not say what they remember because to speak of it would make it real again. Charles IX didn't invent religious violence in France, but he became the face of its most infamous expression. And while many of the monarchs on this list are remembered as victims of their own minds, Charles is remembered for something darker, as a man whose unraveling, whether political, emotional, or psychological, seemed to twist the entire court with him. A king who became less a ruler and more a pressure point in a country poised to detonate. His reign was short, just over a decade from 1560 to 1574. But in that time, France was torn apart, and Charles, for all his pageantry, never seemed entirely in control. He was 15 when he took the crown, but his mother, Catherine de' Medici, never really let go of the reins. Catherine was one of the most powerful and controversial political figures of the century. A Florentine woman who had survived multiple regencies, dynastic crises, and civil conflicts with the kind of pragmatic cruelty that made enemies call her Machiavellian and friends say nothing at all. It was Catherine who arranged Charles's marriage. Catherine who negotiated with Protestant and Catholic factions. Catherine who managed the court. Charles watched and approved and obeyed until he didn't, until he broke. The story of Charles IX is, inevitably, the story of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, the event that cemented his name in horror and speculation, and also the moment when many began to whisper that the king had lost his grip on reality. It happened in August 1572. Paris was hot, uneasy, volatile. The city was hosting a high-profile wedding. Charles's sister Marguerite de Valois was marrying Henry of Navarre, a leading Protestant noble, a Huguenot. The goal was reconciliation, religious peace, a symbolic uniting of warring factions. But France was not interested in symbolism. The night after the wedding, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, a prominent Protestant leader, was nearly assassinated in the streets. He survived, barely, and retreated to convalesce. Protestants at court demanded justice. Catholic factions seethed. The atmosphere turned electric. Then the order came. In the early hours of August 24th, royal guards and Catholic militias began slaughtering Protestant guests. It spread through Paris. It spread beyond Paris. It became not a riot, but a coordinated purge, with thousands of Huguenots murdered across France in the days and weeks that followed. Charles IX was king during this. Was he the architect? Historians argue. Some believe Charles signed off under pressure from Catherine, convinced that killing a few Protestant leaders would prevent a coup. Others suggest he was manipulated, or panicked, or simply overruled. Still others claim that Charles himself gave the go-ahead for the mass killing, not just as strategy, but as vengeance. What we do know is this. After the massacre, Charles changed. Accounts from the period describe a young king increasingly paranoid, emotionally volatile, and prone to erratic behavior. He was said to suffer from insomnia, guilt, and violent outbursts. He reportedly claimed to hear screams in the night, He grew obsessed with hunting. A distraction, some said, from his own conscience. His health deteriorated. His mood swung wildly. By the time he died in 1574, at just 23 years old, Charles was physically wasted, coughing blood, and largely sidelined by his mother, his courtiers, and the trauma of what he had overseen. The official cause was tuberculosis. The unofficial cause, in many eyes, was something deeper. The psychological collapse of a young man who watched his kingdom fracture and helped swing the axe. So was Charles IX mentally ill? There is no formal diagnosis, no physician's report declaring insanity, but the evidence we do have paints a picture of psychological fragmentation. Modern historians and psychologists have suggested possibilities: post-traumatic stress, major depressive disorder, paranoia, or a reactive psychosis following the massacre. Others are more cautious, arguing that Charles's behavior, while erratic, might have been within the range of expected responses for a monarch under extraordinary stress, guilt, and chronic illness. But here's what's undeniable. His mind unraveled in parallel with his rule. Charles wasn't incapacitated in the way Henry VI was. He didn't lose the crown to formal regency, like George III, but his authority was increasingly hollowed out. After 1572, real power drifted back to Catherine. Policy became reactive, fractured, driven by crisis. It is telling that by the end of his reign, Charles's court was full of whisperers, those who spoke of his instability not as speculation but as accepted fact. Not everyone agreed on the cause, but few believed he was fully fit to govern. He had become a symbol of everything unstable in France itself: young, frenzied, devout, guilt-ridden, and dangerous. Even his final words, allegedly spoken to his nurse, carried the tone of a man broken from within. "Oh, nurse, nurse, what blood I have shed! God forgive me." Were those words actually spoken? Who knows? But they have survived because they feel true. Because Charles IX is remembered less as a monarch than as a cracked mirror, someone whose internal disarray reflected the deeper fractures in his kingdom. And this is what makes his case so chilling. Because Charles IX is not an outlier. He is the center of a pattern in which mental distress, political crisis, and historical interpretation are tangled so tightly together that they become indistinguishable. A pattern in which illness is not always medical. It is moral, metaphorical, or mythological. And when history cannot explain a monarch's choices, or cannot forgive them, it often diagnoses them instead. Charles IX may have been traumatized, disturbed, unstable, or he may have been simply human, overwhelmed by forces too large to manage, too violent to contain, and too complex for his age. In the end, it doesn't matter whether he was mad in a clinical sense, because history decided he was. And once history makes that decision, it rarely reconsiders. Which brings us to the final monarch in our sequence. A king whose reign closed the curtain on centuries of Bourbon rule. A man remembered as a tyrant, a man some called unwell, and a man whose pathology may have lived not in his mind, but in the legacy he left behind. Ferdinand VII of Spain, 25. Ferdinand VII of Spain. Ferdinand VII's reign has a smell to it, like scorched parchment, sealed decrees, and the slow rot of a nation learning that some kings don't simply fail. They preserve failure like it's a virtue. Born into the troubled twilight of the Spanish Bourbons, Ferdinand's life was tangled with restoration, repression, and something more elusive: the creeping suspicion that his behavior wasn't merely cruel or cowardly, but unwell. Even his enemies had trouble deciding whether he was a villain or a victim, whether he acted with calculated self-interest or with the mechanical panic of a man permanently out of his depth, whether the chaos around him was designed or simply mirrored the chaos within. To understand the whispers about his mind, we have to rewind to a moment of imperial collapse. The year is 1808. Napoleon's armies are marching into Spain, under the pretext of helping secure the throne. But help in the Napoleonic dictionary tends to mean theft, and the Spanish crown is about to be stolen. Ferdinand, already proclaimed king after pressuring his father Charles IV to abdicate, finds himself lured to Bayonne. There, Napoleon forces him to abdicate as well. The Bourbon monarchy is dismantled. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, is placed on the throne. And Spain erupts into a war of resistance that will last for years. Ferdinand is sent into polite captivity in France. And here begins one of the strangest chapters in royal psychology. Because Ferdinand, heir to a collapsing empire, deposed king of a burning nation, is not especially miserable. In fact, by many accounts, he is curiously docile. Courtiers later recalled that during his years in French custody, he showed little concern for Spanish suffering, little ambition to escape, and a startling comfort with his reduced circumstances. He played cards. He took walks. He waited. It was as if the throne had always been an uncomfortable chair to him, and exile came as a kind of relief. Some observers saw this as political patience. Others, less charitably, saw it as emotional detachment bordering on the pathological, a lack of empathy, a strange passivity in the face of national catastrophe. Later, these impressions would be recast in darker tones, as Ferdinand proved not passive at all, but eager to turn reaction into religion. In 1813, after Napoleon's fortunes turned, Ferdinand was restored to the throne. He returned to Spain greeted as El Deseado, the desired one. His people expected reform, reward, or at least some constitutional olive branch in exchange for their years of war, blood, and loyalty. Instead, they got Ferdinand. He promptly abolished the liberal constitution of 1812, reinstated absolute monarchy, and began systematically dismantling any political structure not carved directly in his image. Repression replaced reconciliation. Censorship replaced dialogue. Constitutionalism was recast as heresy. And once again, observers began to ask, what exactly was going on in this man's head? Some described him as paranoid, convinced that plots surrounded him, even as his allies deserted him. Others called him indecisive, emotionally volatile, or dangerously manipulable. He vacillated between bursts of authoritarian certainty and prolonged spells of strategic inaction. His personal letters veer between dull formality and sudden, almost obsessive fixations on protocol, loyalty, and rank. And yet, he clung to the throne with the fierce, twitching grip of a man who both feared power and could not live without it. Was it madness? The evidence is slippery. There are no clear medical records, no declared episodes of psychosis, no physicians issuing warnings. Ferdinand's mental state was never formally questioned in the way that Charles VI's or George III's was. But there is, across the documents, a growing pattern of behaviors that suggests something beneath the surface was fractured. He was deeply suspicious of advisors, yet utterly reliant on them. He appointed and dismissed ministers with alarming frequency, unable to tolerate dissent but terrified of isolation. He reversed major policies with little warning. He made promises and broke them within days. He ignored famine reports, ignored infrastructure crises, ignored nearly everything that did not directly involve his own safety, prestige, or control. What emerges is the portrait of a man disconnected not from reality entirely, but from reality's consequences. Some historians have floated retrospective diagnoses, narcissistic traits, possible schizoid tendencies, an anxiety disorder masked by overcompensation. Others reject any clinical labeling and argue that Ferdinand's behavior was the product of trauma, dynastic pressure, and political infantilization. And still others say, does it matter? Because whether Ferdinand was mentally ill, emotionally impaired, or simply committed to self-preservation at all costs, the results were the same. Spain, under his rule, regressed. The liberal experiments of the early 1800s were buried. Universities were gutted. The Inquisition, technically abolished, was allowed to linger in ghostly form. Political prisoners filled jails. Press freedom was extinguished. And worst of all, the very notion of a Spanish constitutional identity, secular, progressive, modern, was stamped out. He wasn't just a reactionary. He was an anti-memory, a king who wanted Spain to forget itself. And yet, even in this, Ferdinand seemed unmoored. His repression lacked ideological consistency. He didn't govern with the brutal clarity of an authoritarian visionary, nor with the detached elegance of a Machiavellian prince. His court was full of infighting, his bureaucracy a shambles, his international posture weak and uncertain. He did not shape Spain. He smothered it. And perhaps the most damning evidence of psychological disturbance isn't in his laws, but in his succession. In 1830, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, allowing his daughter Isabella to inherit the throne. This enraged his brother, Don Carlos, who had been the assumed heir under Salic law. When Ferdinand died in 1833, the result was instant civil war, the Carlist Wars, which would bleed Spain for decades. It was, in essence, Ferdinand's final legacy, a kingdom too traumatized to move forward, too divided to stay still, and too uncertain whether its late king had been a tyrant, a fool, or something stranger. A man who may not have been clinically mad, but who ruled like someone whose inner world was permanently out of alignment with the nation he was meant to guide. And here, at the end of our list, the question comes full circle. What does it mean to call a monarch mad? Sometimes, as with Charles VI or George III, the case is clear. Severe episodes, medical witnesses, lasting political consequences. Other times, as with Ferdinand VII, the diagnosis is less certain. The symptoms blur into strategy. The cruelty disguises the instability. The throne becomes both a shield and a trap. History loves to categorize. But power, especially absolute power, muddies the water. Because when you're a king or queen, your private breakdown becomes public doctrine. Your fears become laws. Your mood becomes national policy. And your illness, if it exists, will never stay confined to the palace. It seeps. It echoes. It writes itself into the bones of your people. And perhaps that's the real reason these 25 rulers matter. Not because they were strange, but because their minds, in failing or fracturing, showed us something about rule itself. That no crown is ever worn alone. That no monarchy is truly immune to the mind behind it. And that sometimes, the most dangerous thing about royal madness is how long it can pass for ordinary politics. The mystery lingers, not in what they suffered, but in what we were willing to call sane.